there is a sound that most of us have forgotten how to listen for. It is the sound of water moving downhill, not in a rush, not in a torrent, but in a long, unhurried descent, so gentle that the water itself seems unaware it is falling at all. This was the sound that once ran beneath the streets of Rome, day and night, for centuries without pause, carried across hundreds of miles of hill and valley and open plain, and arriving, at the end of its journey, having dropped in elevation by no more than the width of a human hand for every mile it had travelled. It is worth pausing on that fact before anything else is said, because everything in this story will return to it. A structure built more than 2,000 years ago, using no pumps, no engines, no source of power beyond the pull of the earth itself, carried water across a continent with a precision of grade that would not be equaled again for over 1,000 years. Engineers working with modern instruments, with lasers and satellites and computer modeling, still remove their hats, so to speak, when they walk the line of a Roman aqueduct and understand what it actually required to keep a river falling so slowly, so evenly, across such an enormous distance that it never ran dry and never overflowed. This is the story of the Roman aqueducts, and it begins, as most stories of ambition do, with a scarcity that could no longer be ignored. To understand why Rome built what it built, it helps to remember what Rome once was. Long before it commanded a Mediterranean world, before its legions had marched into Gaul and Hispania and the deserts beyond Egypt, Rome was a modest settlement clustered along the banks of the Tiber, drawing its water the way every small town of the ancient world did, from the river itself, from shallow wells sunk into the earth, from springs that bubbled up along the hillsides where the 7 hills met the valley floor. For a town of a few thousand people, this was enough. The Tiber was close, the wells were sufficient, and the springs, though modest, could be trusted to refill themselves season after season. There was no reason in those early centuries to imagine that water might ever become a problem requiring an empire's ingenuity to solve. But Rome did not stay small, and it did not stay modest, and the trouble with wells is that they do not grow the way a city grows. A well is a fixed thing, tied to the water table beneath it, indifferent to how many mouths above it now need drinking, how many gardens need irrigating, how many bathhouses and fountains and public latrines a swelling population might wish to build. As Rome's population climbed, first into the tens of thousands, then, by some estimates, past 500,000, and eventually, at its height, toward numbers not seen again in a European city until the modern era, the old sources of water simply could not keep pace. The Tiber itself, meanwhile, was becoming less a source of clean water than a receptacle for the waste of an increasingly crowded city. Its banks lined with tanneries and slaughterhouses, and the runoff of streets never designed to hold so many feet. To drink from it, or from wells too near it, was to invite the fevers and stomach illnesses that ancient writers described again and again without ever quite understanding their cause. Rome had grown into something the river town of its founding had never anticipated, and its old arrangements with water, casual, local, small in scale, were no longer sufficient for what the city had become. This is the quiet paradox that sits at the center of the entire history that follows, and it is worth naming clearly here at the outset, because it will not resolve itself quickly. Rome, at the time it began to solve its water problem, possessed no pumps capable of moving large volumes of water uphill or across long distances. It possessed no engines, no source of mechanical power beyond human and animal muscle, no way to force water where gravity did not already want it to go. And yet, over the centuries that followed, Roman engineers would build a network of channels stretching, in total, well over 250 miles just to supply the city of Rome alone. with sister systems built to serve cities across Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and the Greek world. Structures that moved staggering volumes of water, day after day, year after year, using nothing but the patient, unforgiving logic of a slope. If a channel dropped too quickly, the water would rush and scour and eventually tear the channel apart. If it dropped too slowly or not at all, the water would stagnate or simply refuse to move. Somewhere between those two failures lay a narrow band of possibility, a gradient so gentle that the human eye alone could never perceive it. And it was within that narrow band that Roman engineers were required to work, across valleys, through hillsides, over the low places where a river would need to be raised on arches so it could keep falling, ever so slightly, toward the city that waited for it. It is tempting, looking back from a modern vantage point, to imagine ancient engineering as something cruder than our own, a matter of brute force, endless slave labor, and structures overbuilt simply because no one yet understood how to build them efficiently. The Roman aqueducts resist that assumption almost immediately. What they demanded was not brute force, but almost unbearable patience. Patience in surveying, patience in measurement, patience in construction that could stretch across a decade or more for a single channel. Patience in maintenance that required constant walking of the line, constant inspection, constant small repair for as long as the aqueduct was expected to run. They demanded a form of mathematical confidence that had to be correct not approximately, but essentially exactly, because an error invisible on a drafting table could mean, miles away, a channel running backward or a channel running dry. And so, before any channel was cut, before any arch was raised, Rome had to arrive at an idea, a single conceptual leap that made everything else possible. That idea was gradient, the understanding that water, left alone, will always seek the lowest available path, and that if you can shape a channel to fall, ever so slightly, in one continuous and unbroken direction, water will travel that channel of its own accord, requiring no push, no force, no fuel, only time and a shape correctly made. It sounds almost too simple to have required genius. But translating that simple idea into a physical channel running for scores of miles across uneven ground that rose and fell and buckled and folded in ways no one had yet mapped with any precision, required a discipline of observation that few civilizations before Rome had ever sustained at such a scale. This, then, is the story that lies ahead. The story of how a city that had outgrown its wells solved a problem that had no precedent, using instruments simple enough to hold in one hand and knowledge patient enough to be applied across a lifetime, and sometimes across several lifetimes, of engineers who would never live to see the aqueducts they designed finished and running. It is a story that moves slowly, deliberately, the way the water itself moved, down from springs in distant hills, through channels cut into rock and covered against the sun, across valleys on arches whose shadows still fall, in places across quiet fields, and into a city that had learned, out of necessity, to think in terms of centuries rather than seasons. Before we follow that water from its spring to its fountain, it is worth sitting for a moment longer with the strangeness of what was accomplished, because that strangeness is easy to lose once the details of engineering begin to accumulate. No aqueduct on this scale, carrying this volume of water, this greater distance with this fine, a control over its fall, would be built again in Europe until long after the fall of the empire that raised them. Not through the medieval centuries that followed, not through the early stirrings of the Renaissance, but only with the arrival of modern surveying instruments and industrial construction methods many hundreds of years later. For 1,000 years and more, the aqueducts of Rome stood as the high watermark, so to speak, of what human patience and geometry alone could achieve against the pull of the earth. Some of them, remarkably, are still standing, A few, in places, still carry water. If you're settling in for the evening, this is a good story to fall asleep to. Long, unhurried, built stone by stone and channel by channel, much like the aqueducts themselves. There is no need to follow every detail closely. Let the water carry you, as it once carried Rome, gently downhill, mile after mile, for as long as you care to listen. And if you find this kind of history restful, you are welcome to stay with this channel for the others like it. But for now, there is no rush. Rome itself did not build these aqueducts quickly, and there is no reason we should hurry through the telling of them. Let us begin as the Romans themselves began, not with the arches or the tunnels or the great stone bridges that would come to define this achievement, but with the problem underneath it all, a city that had simply, quietly, outgrown the water it was given. In the earliest years of Rome, before the arches and the channels, before the very idea of carrying water across whole valleys had occurred to anyone, the city drank from what lay close at hand. It drank from the Tiber, brown and slow and carrying with it everything upstream had discarded. It drank from shallow wells, sunk into the soft volcanic ground on which the city stood. Wells that rose and fell with the seasons, that turned brackish in the dry months and sometimes failed altogether. It drank from cisterns, patient stone basins built to catch what fell from the sky during the wet season and hold it jealously against the months when nothing fell at all. These were the sources of a small city, a cluster of hills and huts and modest temples, a settlement of farmers and shepherds who had not yet begun to imagine what Rome would become. For a small city, these sources were enough. They were not elegant, and they were not always clean, but they were sufficient, in the way that a village well is sufficient for a village. The trouble began, as it so often does, not with any single failure, but with growth itself. The slow, accumulating pressure of more people arriving than the old sources were ever built to serve. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Rome was no longer a village. It had become something else entirely. A city with ambitions, a city with walls and forums and a growing hunger for the trappings of permanence. Its population climbed steadily, drawn by opportunity, by conquest, by the simple gravity that cities exert on the people around them. And as the population climbed, the old sources of water began to show their age. The Tiber, never a generous river in the driest months, grew more crowded with the waste of a larger population, more suspect as a source of drinking water, even to people who had few illusions about purity. The wells sunk lower and produced less. The cisterns, however carefully built, could only hold so much, and a dry summer could empty them faster than anyone liked to admit. What had been sufficient for a village of a few thousand was no longer sufficient for a city pressing toward the tens of thousands, and the gap between what the city needed and what the ground could easily provide widened with each passing year. This was not, at first, spoken of as a crisis. Romans of this period were not given to dramatic pronouncements about catastrophe. The sources that survive from the era are sparse and practical, more concerned with censuses and building projects than with public complaint. But beneath the quiet surface of the record, the pressure was real enough. A city without reliable water is a city vulnerable in ways that have nothing to do with armies. It is vulnerable to disease when what water remains grows stagnant and foul in the heat. It is vulnerable to fire when there is not enough water on hand to fight the flames that spread so easily through streets of wood and thatch. It is vulnerable too, in a quieter sense, to the discontent of its own people, because a population that cannot trust its water source is a population with a grievance that touches every household, every day, regardless of wealth or standing. Water, unlike so many of the concerns of governance, could not be deferred or delegated. It had to be solved, and it had to be solved for everyone because thirst does not respect class. It was in this atmosphere, a city outgrowing its ground, its wells failing to keep pace with its ambitions, that the question of water moved from a private inconvenience into a matter of public duty. This shift mattered enormously, and it is easy, looking back across more than 2,000 years, to miss how significant it truly was. In many ancient cities, water remained a private concern for a very long time, something a household solved for itself, through a well dug on its own land or a cistern built beneath its own floor, with those who could not afford such things left to fend for themselves at public fountains or riverbanks. Rome, in this period, began to move away from that model. The scale of the city's growth made private solutions inadequate, and the political culture of the Republic, still young, still finding its shape, began to treat water as something the state itself was responsible for providing. This was a quiet revolution, arriving not as a single dramatic decree, but as a gradual recognition spreading through the offices of Roman governance, that a city could not simply hope its people would find enough to drink. It would have to ensure it. The office through which this recognition finally found its expression was that of the censor, a position of considerable authority in the Roman Republic, responsible not only for maintaining the censor's roles, but for overseeing public morals, public contracts, and increasingly public works. It was a position that carried with it both practical power and symbolic weight, and it was to this office that the history of Roman water ultimately traces its beginning, in the person of a man named Appius Claudius Caecus. Appius Claudius held the censorship in the final years of the 4th century before the Common Era, and he was, by every account that survives, a man of considerable ambition and considerable stubbornness, qualities that would prove essential to what he set in motion. He is remembered today for 2 great public works, undertaken in the same year of his censorship: a road, the Via Appia, which would stretch southward from Rome and become one of the great arteries of the ancient world, and an aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, the first channel ever built to carry water into the city from a source beyond its own ground. The Aqua Appia was, by the standards of what would follow, a modest undertaking. It ran for a distance of some 16 kilometres, drawing its water from springs to the east of the city, and for nearly all of that distance, it ran underground, a buried channel, hidden beneath the soil, following the natural fall of the land so gently and so precisely that the water inside it moved without any mechanical assistance at all, carried only by gravity and the patient skill of whoever had first surveyed its course. There were no soaring arches in this first aqueduct, no grand bridges striding across valleys, no monuments visible from a distance. It was, in its physical form, almost invisible, a hidden thread of stone and water running beneath the fields and hills outside Rome, emerging only where it needed to enter the city itself. And yet this modesty of form belied the enormity of what it represented. For the first time, Rome had reached beyond its own walls, beyond its own ground, and claimed water from a source it did not naturally possess, delivering it to the city through human design rather than the accident of geography. It was, in the truest sense, the beginning of something that had never existed before in the history of the city. The deliberate importation of a natural resource, engineered rather than found. The political weight of this achievement can't be separated from its practical value, because in Rome, public works of this kind were never purely practical. They were also, always, a form of statement, a way for a man or a family or an office to leave a mark on the city that would long outlast any single term of governance. Appius Claudius understood this as well as any man of his age, and the decision to pair a road with an aqueduct in the same year of his censorship was not accidental. Both projects announced the same thing in different languages. that Rome was a city capable of reaching outward, of extending its will across the landscape, of bending the natural world to serve its ambitions. A road that could move armies and trade goods across the countryside, and a channel that could move water into the heart of the city, were both, in their own ways, expressions of power. The power to plan on a scale beyond any single lifetime, and the power to compel the labor and resources necessary to see such plans through. It is worth remembering that Appius Claudius did not personally dig the channel or lay the stone. What he provided was authority, the political will to commission the survey, to secure the funds, to command the labor, and to see the project to completion despite whatever resistance or skepticism it may have encountered along the way. In this sense, the Aqua Appia was as much a monument to Roman governance as it was to Roman engineering, a demonstration that the machinery of the state could be turned toward the sustained, patient work of building something that would serve the public for generations. And so it was, in this quiet and largely unheralded way, that Rome first solved the problem of its own thirst. Not with a single dramatic gesture, but with a buried channel of stone, 16 kilometers long, carrying spring water gently downhill into a city that had simply grown too large for its wells. It would be easy, looking back, to imagine that this first aqueduct settled the matter, that Rome, having found a solution, had no further need to expand upon it. But the truth was quite the opposite. The Aqua Appia was not an ending. It was the barest beginning of an ambition that would occupy the city for the better part of 5 centuries, an ambition that would eventually reach far beyond the springs just outside Rome's walls, across greater distances, over higher ground, and towards sources the earliest Romans could scarcely have imagined tapping. The channel that Appius Claudius built was modest, hidden, and quiet. What it set in motion was anything but. Beneath every arch, every buried channel, every mile of stone conduit that would eventually be built to serve Rome, lay a single principle so simple that it could be stated in a single sentence, and so demanding in its execution that it would occupy the finest surveying minds of the ancient world for half a millennium. Water does not rise. It does not seek height. Left alone, it will only ever move downward, and it will do so along whatever path offers it the gentlest, most unbroken descent. This was not a discovery unique to Rome. Every civilization that had ever dug an irrigation ditch or diverted a stream understood in some rough and practical way that water flowed downhill. But understanding a principle in the rough and applying it with precision across dozens of miles of unpredictable terrain were 2 entirely different matters, separated by a gulf that only careful measurement could close. What Roman engineers grasped, and grasped with an obsessiveness that would come to define their entire hydraulic tradition, was that an aqueduct was not a structure built to fight against gravity. It was a structure built to surrender to it, completely and with total precision, over distances that might stretch for 60, 70, in some cases over 90 miles from source to city. The slope required was almost absurdly gentle. Water needed to fall, yes, but not quickly and not steeply. A channel with too sharp a gradient would send its water rushing forward with such force that it would erode the very stone and mortar meant to contain it, wearing away joints, undermining foundations, turning a carefully built conduit into a self-destroying ruin within a generation. Too shallow a gradient, meanwhile, and the water would slow to a stagnant crawl, silting the channel bed, breeding the kind of stillness that fouled a supply meant to serve hundreds of thousands of people. The ideal fall, as later surveys of surviving Roman channels would reveal, often amounted to no more than a few inches over the course of an entire mile. Some sections of the aqueducts serving Rome descended at rates so gradual that later engineers, measuring them with modern levels centuries afterward, found gradients of less than 1 part in 3,000, a decline so faint that no unaided human eye could ever have detected it standing on the ground. It could only be found and held and carried onward for tens of miles through careful measurement repeated over and over, day after day, across every valley and hillside and outcrop of stone the land put in the way. To achieve this, the engineers of Rome relied on instruments that, by modern standards, were startlingly simple, and yet were capable, in careful hands, of extraordinary accuracy. Chief among these was the chorobates, a long wooden bench, perhaps 20 feet in length, fitted with legs and cross braces to hold it steady, and topped with a groove running its full length that could be filled with water. When the bench was level, the water sat evenly along the groove from end to end. When it was not, the water pooled visibly towards the lower side, offering the surveyor an immediate, simple, and remarkably sensitive indication of true horizontal level. Some versions of the instrument also employed plumb lines hanging from the cross braces, marked against fixed points to confirm what the water already showed. It was not an elegant machine. It required 2 or more men to carry it, to set it down carefully on uneven ground, to shim its legs against the slope of a hillside until the water inside ran level. But it worked, and it worked well enough that surveys taken along its readings, section by section, could be added together across enormous distances to determine, with real confidence, whether a proposed channel route would carry water in the direction intended, or whether it would betray the engineers and run the wrong way entirely. Alongside the chorobates stood other instruments, borrowed and adapted from the broader tradition of Roman surveying that had already been refined for centuries in the laying out of roads, boundaries, and military camps. The groma, an upright staff topped with a horizontal cross fitted with plumb lines hanging from each of its 4 arms, allowed a surveyor to establish straight lines and right angles across open country, sighting along the hanging cords to align distant points with startling precision. It was the instrument that had given Roman roads their famous, unwavering straightness, and it found a second life in the planning of aqueduct routes, where a surveyor needed to fix a steady line of travel long before the question of gradient could even be addressed. The dioptra, a more sophisticated device with roots in Greek astronomical and surveying tradition, employed sighting tubes and graduated circles to measure angles of elevation and depression with a precision the chorobates alone could not offer, particularly across long sight lines where a water level might prove impractical to carry or read. Together, these instruments, none of them individually remarkable, formed a toolkit that, applied with patience and repetition, could resolve one of the hardest problems in ancient engineering. How to know with confidence that a fall of a few inches per mile would still be a fall, and not by some accumulated error over 60 miles a rise. The discipline this demanded can hardly be overstated. A single mistake in reading the chorobates, a single misjudged sighting through the dioptra, repeated and compounded across dozens of survey stations, could send an entire project astray, could mean that water refused to flow, or flowed the wrong direction, or pooled uselessly behind some unseen high point buried within a channel that had already cost months of labor and enormous sums to build. There was no way to test the finished product except by finishing it. There was no partial trial run, no way to send water halfway down an incomplete channel and learn from its behavior before committing to the rest. The surveyors had to be right the first time, across the entire length of the route, before a single spade of earth was properly turned for construction, and they had to remain right through every valley crossing, every hillside cut, every stretch of tunnel bored blind through rock, sustaining that same impossibly gentle decline without interruption from spring to city. It was a task that asked for something closer to religious devotion than ordinary competence, a willingness to walk a stretch of ground over and over, instrument in hand, checking and rechecking a fall so slight that the land itself seemed to deny it existed at all. The men who carried out this work, the agrimensors, occupy a strange and rather quiet place in the historical record, unlike the emperors, aediles, and censors whose names were carved into commemorative inscriptions and celebrated in the writings of Frontinus and other chroniclers of Rome's water supply. The surveyors themselves rarely appear as individuals. They are, for the most part, an anonymous profession, known collectively rather than personally, remembered through their function rather than their names. Some fragments survive: land surveying manuals, portions of technical treatises, references scattered through later Roman writing that describe the training such men received, the mathematical and geometric education expected of them, the social position they occupied as skilled specialists, somewhere between common labor and the honored ranks of architects and engineers. They were men who spent their working lives outdoors, walking rough ground in all seasons, carrying or directing the carrying of wooden benches and staffs and sighting tubes across hillsides that offered no roads, no paths, often no clear line of sight from one survey point to the next. They worked in teams, communicating findings across distances through shouted confirmations or relayed signals, translating raw sightings into the numbers that would eventually become construction instructions for the masons and laborers who followed behind them. It is worth pausing before the survey work gives way to the labor of construction itself, to consider what these men actually confronted once they left the comfortable flatlands near a city and began tracing a route towards some distant spring. The land, of course, does not offer gentle, continuous slopes as a courtesy to engineers. It rises and falls unevenly, throws up ridges, cuts itself with river valleys, folds into hills that a channel cannot simply climb over. Since climbing was precisely the one thing an aqueduct, dependent entirely on gravity, could never do. Every irregularity in the terrain between a source and a city represented a problem that the perfect, unbroken gradient somehow had to solve, without ever asking the water to do what water cannot do. A valley in the surveyed path meant the channel would either have to trace an immense detour along the contour of the land, adding miles, sometimes tripling or quadrupling the straight-line distance between source and destination, or it would have to be carried across the gap entirely, held aloft on some structure built specifically to preserve the gradient through open air. A ridge of high ground meant either a similarly long diversion around its flank, or a tunnel bored directly through solid rock, blind, guided only by the surveyor's calculations and the faith of the men digging, that the line they followed underground still obeyed the same gentle, unerring fall, established months earlier on the surface above. This was the struggle now waiting just ahead of every Roman aqueduct project, the moment when the elegant simplicity of gravity and gradient met the stubborn complexity of real ground. The surveyors could establish the line. They could calculate, with their water levels and their sighting instruments, exactly how much fall was needed and exactly where that fall had to occur. But translating a number, a fraction of an inch per 100 feet, into miles of stone and mortar and open valley crossings, into tunnels driven through mountains by men who could not see the other side, would demand an entirely different kind of ingenuity, one that the next stage of the work would reveal in full. Before any of that ingenuity could be applied, the land itself had to be understood, and understanding land, in the ancient world, meant walking it. The men who found the routes for Rome's aqueducts did not sit at a table and draw a line across a map, because no map existed that could tell them what they needed to know. They went out on foot, day after day, following the folds of hills and the threads of streams, carrying their instruments with them, and trusting, as much as anything, the evidence of their own legs and eyes. A spring might look promising from a distance, its water clear and cold and abundant in the wet months. but it had to be watched through a full turn of the seasons before anyone could trust it. The surveyors, or the men working under their direction, would return to a source again and again in the dry heat of late summer and in the sodden weeks of early spring, testing whether the flow held steady or whether it dwindled to nothing when it was needed most. A source that failed in August was worse than no source at all, because a city that had come to depend on it would learn its weakness at the worst possible moment, and there would be no quick way to replace what had gone dry. Once a spring or a cluster of springs had proven itself reliable across the seasons, the harder work began, because water freed from the ground does not know where a city wants it to go. It has to be persuaded, coaxed along a path that falls, however gently, the entire distance from source to destination. And the land rarely offers such a path without resistance. The men tracing these routes carried their levels and their sighting rods, instruments simple by later standards but demanding in their use, requiring patience and repetition and a willingness to walk the same stretch of ground more than once until the numbers agreed with themselves. They moved slowly in short surveyed segments, checking and rechecking the fall, because an error compounded over 30 or 40 or 50 miles could mean the difference between water that reached the city and water that pooled uselessly somewhere in the countryside, having lost all the fall it needed to keep moving. The terrain, more often than not, refused to cooperate. A valley would open where the surveyors needed level ground, dropping away sharply enough that the channel, if it followed the natural contour, would lose its carefully rationed gradient in a single plunge and rise on the far side. A hill would rise where they needed the line to continue its gentle, imperceptible descent, blocking the path entirely and forcing a choice between going around, which might add miles to the route, or going through, which meant tunneling, with all the danger and labor that entailed. Rivers cut across the intended path as well, indifferent to the needs of a distant city, and where a river had to be crossed, the engineers faced yet another problem. Since the channel could not simply dip down to meet the water and climb back up the other side without breaking the gradient that made the entire system work. Each of these obstacles, the sunken valley, the rising hill, the crossing river, demanded its own solution, worked out on the ground rather than in the abstract, and the solutions varied according to what the landscape allowed and what the resources of the moment could provide. Where the ground was too low, later stages of construction would raise the water on arches, lifting the channel above the valley floor so that it could continue falling at its proper rate without ever touching the earth beneath it. Where the ground was too high, the builders would cut through it, sometimes with an open trench, and sometimes, when the hill was substantial, with a tunnel bored directly through the rock, a process slow and dark and uncertain, since the men digging from one side could not always be certain they would meet, precisely and safely, the men digging from the other. These solutions, the soaring arch and the buried tunnel, are the two faces of Roman aqueduct construction that have survived most vividly in memory, and for good reason, since they represent the moments where the engineer's ambition met its greatest tests and, in most cases, succeeded. But it would be a mistake, and a common one, to imagine that these dramatic crossings and cuttings made up the greater part of any aqueduct's length. They did not. They were the exception, the necessary intervention where the land simply would not allow the water to pass by any gentler means. The greater part of the work, the quiet majority of every channel that carried water toward Rome or any other city fed by this system, lay beneath the surface of the earth, invisible, unremarkable, and almost entirely unrecorded in the popular imagination. Consider what this meant in practice. An aqueduct stretching 40 or 50 miles from its source to its destination might include only a few miles, sometimes only a few hundred feet, of visible arcade, the towering arches that appear in paintings and photographs and that have come, over the centuries, to stand as the symbol of the entire achievement. The rest of the route, the overwhelming majority of it, ran underground, in a covered channel called a specus, cut into a trench and then sealed over with stone or concrete, buried beneath fields, beneath hillsides, beneath the ordinary undisturbed surface of the countryside, so that a farmer might walk across his land for years without ever knowing that a river of drinking water moved silently beneath his feet, following its patient, calculated descent toward a city he might never visit. This buried channel was not a lesser or a lazier solution than the arches. It was, in fact, the default method, the preferred approach wherever the land allowed it, because burying the channel protected the water from evaporation under the summer sun, from contamination by animals or debris, from the freezing that could crack an exposed conduit in the cold months, and from the simple wear of weather over time. The arches were not built because they were superior. They were built because, in certain stretches, there was no other way to keep the water falling at the rate the calculations demanded. Everywhere else, the Romans put the channel into the earth and left it there, unseen, doing its quiet work without complaint or comment. This fact, once understood, invites a kind of reflection that runs against the grain of how these structures are usually remembered. The image most people carry of a Roman aqueduct, the tiered arches marching across a valley in golden stone, is not false, but it is deeply incomplete, a fragment mistaken for the whole. It is rather like remembering a great river only by the single waterfall where it happens to be most visible, and forgetting the 100 miles of quiet current that carried it there, and the 100 miles that carried it onward afterward. The arches endure in memory partly because they endure in fact, standing centuries after the empire that built them has fallen, visible from a distance, photographed, painted, walked beneath by generations of visitors who come specifically to see them. The buried channels, by contrast, have mostly vanished from view, filled in, built over, ploughed under, forgotten by all but the archaeologists and historians who go looking for their traces in old surveys and chance excavations. And yet it was the buried channel, not the arch, that made up the true bulk of the labour, the true bulk of the stone and mortar and human effort that went into every one of these systems. There is something worth sitting with in that imbalance, in the fact that the most celebrated portions of Roman engineering were, by length, the smallest part of what was actually built, while the greatest part of the effort disappeared entirely from view, buried the moment it was finished, never meant to be seen again by anyone at all. The men who cut those trenches, who laid the stone floor and built the low stone walls and capped the whole channel with a covering of slabs or concrete, worked knowing that their labour would vanish beneath the soil almost as soon as it was completed, that no one walking overhead would ever admire what they had made, that the credit and the wonder would flow, if it flowed anywhere, toward the distant stretch of visible arches built by other hands entirely. And still the work went on, mile after mile, season after season, because the water did not care whether its passage was celebrated or hidden. It only needed the gradient to hold, the channel to remain sound, the path to continue its patient fall toward the city that waited at the end of it. This is, perhaps, one of the quieter truths carried inside every aqueduct, and inside a great deal of engineering more broadly, that the visible achievement, the part that draws the eye and survives in memory, often rests upon a much larger foundation of invisible, uncelebrated labour, work done underground, out of sight, by men whose names were never recorded and whose individual contributions can no longer be traced. The arches at a river crossing might have been built by a particular team, under a particular foreman, working to particular specifications that some historian centuries later manages to reconstruct from an inscription or a fragment of record. But the miles of buried conduit that fed into those arches, and the miles more that carried the water onward after it descended from them, were built by countless other men whose work has left almost no trace beyond the channel itself, still lying in places exactly where they left it. 2,000 years ago, empty now of water but intact in its stone, a monument to labor that was never meant to be seen, and that, in a sense, still is not. Before any channel could be cut, before any arch could be raised against the sky, the builders of the aqueducts had to answer a quieter question, one that received no monument and no inscription, and yet shaped everything that followed. What would the water actually pass through, and what would hold that passage up for as long as Rome required it? The answer lay scattered across the countryside, in forms the engineers had come to know, with the patience of men who had spent lifetimes reading stone. There was tough, soft and workable when freshly quarried, hardening slowly with exposure to air, plentiful in the hills around the city, and cheap enough to use in great volume where great volume was needed. There was travertine, harder, paler, quarried from the beds near Tibur, capable of taking a finer finish and bearing greater loads, reserved for places where the structure would face the heaviest strain or the most public eye. The piers of the great arches, the voussoirs of the largest spans, the visible faces where the state wished its work to look as durable as it in fact was. There was brick, fired in kilns scattered through the countryside, useful for facing walls and for the vaulted ceilings of the channels themselves, offering a uniform surface where irregular stone would not do. And there was, above all, the sand, dark and gritty, drawn from the volcanic deposits that lay beneath so much of the region, a material so ordinary in appearance that a traveller might walk past a pile of it without a second glance, unaware that it was, in its way, one of the quiet reasons Rome could build what it built. That sand, mixed with lime and water and packed around aggregate of broken stone or brick, became what the Romans called opus cementitium, a concrete unlike anything used before it, and, in certain respects, unlike much that came after it as well. The volcanic material reacted with the lime in a manner the builders could not have explained in the language of chemistry, though they understood it perfectly well in the language of experience. Having watched generation after generation of walls and vaults hold their shape and their strength long after simpler mortars had crumbled, the reaction bound the mixture at a molecular level that later engineers, examining fragments of the concrete many centuries afterward, would find had actually grown stronger with age in places, the interior structure knitting itself more tightly as water worked slowly through it over the years, rather than breaking it down as water breaks down so many other things. This was not a discovery that arrived all at once, in a single flash of insight from a single mind. It was, so far as the fragments of the record suggest, a slow accumulation of trial across generations, small adjustments in proportion and technique passed from builder to builder, refined on projects far humbler than the aqueducts before it was trusted with the aqueducts themselves. By the time the great channels were being planned, the mixture was no longer experimental. It was simply how Rome built when Rome intended a thing to last. The gathering of these materials was its own undertaking, quieter than the construction itself, but no less demanding of organization. Quarries had to be opened or expanded in the hills, worked by crews who cut the stone in blocks sized for particular purposes, some destined for the visible piers of the arcades, some for the buried walls of the channel where appearance mattered less than mass and consistency. The stone, once cut, had to be moved, and here the Romans relied on the two methods available to any ancient builder working across distance: the ox cart for the overland stretches, and the river barge wherever a waterway could be found to carry the load instead of an animal's back. Neither method was fast. A team of oxen drawing a laden cart might cover only a handful of miles in a full day's labor. The beasts fed and watered and rested according to a rhythm that no urgency of schedule could override, and the roads themselves, however well built by Roman standards, still exacted their toll in broken axles and worn wheels and the constant small delays of ordinary travel. The barges moved with somewhat less strain on the animals, but were bound entirely to the paths of the rivers, useful where a waterway ran conveniently near a quarry or a work site, and useless everywhere else, which meant that much of the stone still had to complete at least part of its journey by cart, regardless of how far it had come by water. The men who organized this movement of material were rarely named in any surviving record, and yet the scale of what they coordinated deserves to be understood plainly. A single aqueduct, stretching across dozens of miles of countryside, required not one delivery of stone, but a continuous, sustained flow of it, arriving at dozens of separate points along the route simultaneously, timed to match the pace of construction at each site, so that crews were neither left idle, waiting for material, nor buried under more than they could use before it needed to be worked. Lime had to be burned in kilns positioned near enough to the route to make its transport practical, since lime was heavy, bulky in its raw form, and lost potency if stored carelessly or too long before use. Sand had to be dug and carted from its deposits in quantities that matched, roughly, the volume of lime and stone arriving at the same points, so that the proportions the builders required could actually be mixed on site rather than approximated from whatever happened to be at hand. None of this could have functioned through improvisation. It required planning conducted well in advance of the actual laying of a single course of stone. Planning that anticipated where materials would be needed months before the crews doing the kneading had even arrived. Planning that assumed failures of weather, animal, cart, and river, and built in enough slack to absorb them without halting the larger project. The aqueducts, in this sense, were as much a triumph of supply as of engineering, though supply left far fewer traces for later historians to admire, and so it has often gone unmentioned in the retelling, even as it made the retelling possible in the first place. There remained one problem that stone and mortar alone could not solve, and that was the loss of the water itself once it began its long transit through the channel. A conduit built with even the finest concrete and the most carefully cut stone would still, over the course of dozens of miles, lose a portion of its flow to seepage through the smallest imperfections in its walls. A loss that might seem trivial across a single stretch, but that, compounded over the full length of an aqueduct, could represent a meaningful fraction of the water Rome depended upon. The solution the builders developed was a lining known as opus signinum, a preparation of crushed pottery or tile mixed into mortar and applied as a smooth, dense coating across the interior surfaces of the channel, sealing the joints and the pores of the stone beneath it and rendering the walls, once finished, effectively impermeable to the water they were meant to carry rather than absorb. This lining was not decorative. It served no purpose that could be seen from outside the channel, since almost no one but the specialists responsible for maintaining the aqueduct would ever see the interior surface at all. It existed purely for function, a technical answer to a technical problem, applied with the same patience given to the visible arches above ground, even though it would spend its entire existence hidden beneath flowing water, in the dark, doing its quiet work without witness. It is worth pausing on this choice of materials, and on the effort spent securing them, because it reveals something about the intentions of those who ordered these works built that no inscription states outright. A city in less patient circumstances, needing water quickly and cheaply, might have accepted simpler methods, wooden channels perhaps, or masonry laid with weaker mortar, structures that would serve for a generation or two before requiring replacement. Rome, instead, committed to stone quarried at real cost and moved across real distance to a concrete whose properties had been refined over long stretches of accumulated experience rather than convenience, to a lining applied for the sake of efficiency, measured not in months but in centuries. This was, in its way, a form of foresight expressed not in words, but in material choices. A decision made repeatedly at every stage of gathering and building, to spend more now in exchange for endurance later, to treat the aqueduct not as a temporary solution to a present need, but as an inheritance to be handed down to builders and drinkers of water who had not yet been born. That the choice succeeded is evidenced by the channels themselves, many of which outlasted the empire that raised them, carrying water long after the offices that had commissioned them had ceased to exist, standing now as quiet testimony to a people who built, in stone and lime and fire, for a future they would never personally see arrive. The building of an aqueduct was not the work of engineers alone. However carefully their calculations had been drawn, however patiently their surveys had traced the fall of the land across miles of hill and valley. Behind every line on a plan, there stood, eventually, a body of men, and behind every mile of finished channel, there lay months or years of labor, performed by hands whose names, in most cases, have not survived. The surveyors and the master builders might be remembered, if they were remembered at all, in a brief inscription or a passing mention in a text meant for other purposes. The great mass of those who cut the stone, mixed the mortar, hauled the loads, and stood daily in trenches and tunnels breathing dust, were, for the most part, absorbed silently into the achievement they made possible. Their individual labor folded into the larger word, Rome, the way a single drop of water is folded into the current of a river. The workforce assembled for such a project was not uniform. It drew, instead, on several distinct populations, each occupying its own place in a hierarchy that shaped not only wages and conditions, but the very texture of daily survival. At the top, in terms of both skill and status, stood the surveyors and master masons, men whose training allowed them to read the instruments, correct for error, and direct the placement of stone with an authority that came from demonstrated competence rather than birth alone. Beneath them worked contracted specialists, carpenters who built the falsework and scaffolding upon which arches rose, smiths who kept the iron tools sharp and serviceable, lime burners who tended the kilns that produced the mortar, binding the whole structure together. These men were free, in the legal sense, and were paid for their labor, though the terms of that payment, and the leverage they held in negotiating it, varied according to how badly their particular skill was needed at a given moment in the project's life. Below this tier of paid specialists labored the general workforce, and here the record grows harder to read with confidence, because it was here that free labor and enslaved labor stood side by side, performing tasks that from a distance looked identical, but carried, for those performing them, entirely different weights of consequence. Some laborers were free men working for wages, drawn from the countryside or the nearby towns, glad enough of steady work even if the pay was modest and the conditions harsh. Others were enslaved, their labor commanded rather than purchased, their presence on the project a matter of ownership rather than contract. Ancient sources, when they mention labor at all, rarely pause to distinguish carefully between these categories, and modern historians have been left to reconstruct the balance from fragments, building contracts that specify categories of worker, legal texts that regulate the treatment of enslaved labor on public works, and the occasional inscription that names a status alongside a name. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that both kinds of labor were present on most large Roman construction projects, and that the aqueducts, spanning such distances and requiring such sustained effort, would have drawn on both in significant number. The conditions under which this workforce lived stretched, in their own way, almost as far as the aqueduct itself. A work camp assembled to build a channel running many miles across open country could not simply commute from a nearby city each morning and return each evening. The scale of the undertaking demanded that the workforce live, for months and sometimes years, alongside the line of construction, moving forward as the work moved forward, camp following channel, the way a shadow follows its object across changing ground. Such camps would have included not only the laborers themselves, but the apparatus needed to sustain them. Cooking fires, stores of grain, tents or temporary shelters, wells or streams for drinking water. Ironically more immediate than the distant water they were laboring to bring to others. Rations, where they can be reconstructed from surviving records of public works generally, centered on grain, the staple that could be stored, transported and distributed with relative ease across a dispersed workforce. Wine, in modest allowance, was common as well, understood less as luxury than as a practical supplement to water, whose safety could not always be guaranteed at a temporary camp. Meat appears rarely in such records, suggesting it was the exception rather than the rule, reserved perhaps for occasions of particular note rather than daily sustenance. Wages, for those who received them, were modest by any standard, and modest still further when measured against the physical toll of the work performed. Surviving building accounts from Roman public projects, though none survive specifically itemizing every payment made to aqueduct laborers, suggest a structure in which skilled specialists received several times the pay of general laborers, and general laborers received barely enough to sustain themselves and whatever family depended on their earnings. The rhythms of such a wage, paid perhaps by the day or by the completed task, would have shaped the rhythms of camp life in turn. A workforce rising before full light, laboring through the heat of the day with whatever pause custom and overseer allowed, and returning as the light failed to whatever shelter the camp provided, only to rise again the following morning and repeat a labor that, from the perspective of any single worker, must have seemed to stretch toward an almost unimaginable horizon. The aqueduct, after all, was measured not in days but in years. A laborer who joined the project in its early seasons might grow old in relative terms, before the water ever reached the city it was meant to serve. This hierarchy of skill mapped closely onto a hierarchy of danger and comfort, though not always in the direction one might assume. The surveyors and master masons, for all their authority, were not exempt from risk. A man standing atop scaffolding to check the alignment of a rising arch faced the same fall as the laborer beside him, and a miscalculation in his own work could bring the structure down upon workers of every rank indiscriminately. But status did shape exposure in subtler ways. Skilled specialists were more likely to work in positions of relative shelter, under cover, at ground level, with tools suited to precision rather than brute exertion. While general laborers, and enslaved workers most of all, were more likely to be assigned the tasks that offered the least protection, descending into unfinished tunnels where air was thin and collapse a constant possibility, standing exposed on cliff faces to secure the footings of a bridge, laboring in quarries where a single miscut block could crush the man beside it. The record does not offer a tally of the injured or the dead from any specific aqueduct project. No ancient source thought such a tally worth compiling, or if one was compiled, it has not survived. What can be inferred, cautiously, from the general character of ancient construction labor is that death and serious injury were not rare events set apart from the ordinary conduct of the work, but a background reality woven into it, absorbed by camp and family alike as an expected cost of a trade that offered few alternatives to those who practiced it. Amid this largely anonymous labor, the ancient record does preserve occasional moments where an individual voice breaks through, however briefly, and it is worth pausing on one such moment, not because it resolves the larger silence, but because it reminds us that the silence was made of individual people, each with a name, a wage, a complaint, a life beyond the project that consumed their days. Inscriptions connected to Roman public works occasionally name a foreman, a contractor, or a particularly valued craftsman. recording in a few carved words a role that would otherwise have vanished entirely. A phrase noting that a certain man oversaw the laying of a certain stretch of channel, or that a certain contractor was paid a certain sum for a certain completed task. Legal and administrative texts, meanwhile, occasionally preserve complaints or disputes arising from public construction. Disagreements over payment, accusations of shoddy work, petitions concerning conditions. Fragments that survive not because anyone intended to preserve the voice of an ordinary labourer for posterity, but because a dispute required a record, and the record happened to endure. Such fragments are rare, and none can be said to belong definitively to a specific aqueduct project with the certainty a historian would wish for. But their existence establishes, beyond doubt, that the workforce building these channels was not a faceless mechanism, but a gathering of individuals who negotiated wages, voiced grievances, and left, however faintly, a trace of their own presence in the vast undertaking that swallowed their labour. It is worth resting briefly in the quiet weight of this fact before moving forward with the story of the channel itself. The aqueducts are remembered, and rightly, as one of the great achievements of Roman engineering, a testament to patient calculation and imperial ambition sustained across generations. But that achievement was purchased, mile by mile, by the daily labour of men whose names have mostly been lost, who ate modest rations in temporary camps stretched across unfamiliar countryside, who bore, according to their rank, greater or lesser shares of the danger the work demanded, and who received, for their trouble, wages that kept them alive, rather than wages that recognized what they had built. The grandeur of the finished channel, rising in arches across a valley, or running silent beneath a hillside, owes its existence to this quieter, harder history. And it is fitting, before the story turns to the crossing of valleys and the raising of arches, to acknowledge the human cost paid steadily and mostly without record, beneath the visible surface of an empire's ambition. For all the labour invested in cutting channels through hillsides and boring passages beneath ridgelines, the land itself would eventually refuse to cooperate with the simplest of the engineer's tools, which was patience. A buried channel could follow a slope for miles, descending so gradually that a man walking beside it would feel no incline at all. And this was the entire genius of the method. But genius of this kind depended on the ground holding a certain shape, a certain willingness to fall away slowly rather than all at once. When the land refused, when a valley opened suddenly beneath the surveyed line and dropped away in a manner no tunnel could follow, without losing the gradient it had so carefully preserved, the underground channel reached the edge of its usefulness. The water could not be made to fall faster than the design allowed, nor could it be poured downward and expected to rise again on the far side. For water, however patiently coaxed, obeyed gravity without exception. The engineers understood this limitation as clearly as they understood the slope itself, and they had known, long before the surveying parties reached such places, that at some point, along nearly every long aqueduct's course, the land would fall away in a way that no tunnel could gracefully absorb, and the channel would either have to detour for miles around the valley's edges, adding distance and cost and years to a project already vast, or it would have to be carried across open air on a structure built for exactly that purpose. The Romans arrived, through years of experimentation and through the slow accumulation of engineering knowledge, passed from one generation of surveyors to the next, at a solution that would come to define, more than any other feature, the world's image of Roman ambition. Where the ground dropped too low to carry the channel underground, they built upward instead, raising a bridge that was not for carts or for pedestrians, but for water alone, a structure whose only cargo was the invisible cargo of a covered channel running along its uppermost tier. And they built these bridges not as a single flat span, but as arcades, as long processions of stone arches marching across a valley floor, each arch supporting the next, each pier planted where the surveyors calculated the ground could bear its weight until the channel had been carried, high above olive groves and vineyards and streams, to the point on the far hillside where it could once again disappear beneath the earth and resume its patient underground descent. The arch itself, the shape upon which this entire solution depended, deserves attention, because its strength was not obvious to observers unfamiliar with the physics that made it work. And even now, centuries after its widespread use, people who walk beneath a Roman arch often assume its strength comes from the mass of the stone alone, when in truth the strength comes from the arrangement of that mass, from the geometry the builders imposed upon it. An arch works by compression, by directing the weight of everything above it, the stone, the mortar, the covered channel, and the water within it, downward and outward along a curved path, so that each stone in the arch pushes against its neighbors, rather than resting its full weight on the stone below. The keystone, set at the arch's highest point, does not bear the greatest weight as many assume, but rather completes the geometry that allows every other stone to lean into its neighbor in a continuous chain of compression, transferring the load down through the curve of the arch and into the piers that support it, and from the piers into the ground itself. This meant that an arch, properly built, could bear loads that would crush a flat beam of the same material, because stone is remarkably strong under compression and remarkably weak under tension. And the arch's entire purpose was to ensure that every stone within it experienced only the kind of stress the material could endure. The Romans did not invent the arch, for it had appeared in earlier civilizations in more limited forms. But they refined it, standardized it, and built with it at a scale no previous culture had attempted, until the arch became not merely a device for spanning doorways, but a means of carrying entire rivers of water across landscapes that had never been meant to hold them. The construction of an arcade, once the decision to build one had been made, followed a sequence that repeated itself, with local variation across every valley the aqueducts crossed. The piers came first, rising from carefully prepared foundations sunk into the valley floor, sometimes into bedrock, sometimes into soil that had to be tested and reinforced before it could be trusted to bear the enormous weight that would eventually rest upon it. The piers were built of the same stone that had been quarried and dressed elsewhere along the route, or in some cases of stone taken from quarries near the valley itself, chosen for its ability to bear compressive loads over what the builders intended to be centuries rather than decades. Once a pair of piers had risen to the height required, a wooden framework called centering was constructed between them, a temporary skeleton in the shape of the arch that would eventually stand in stone, built by carpenters whose skill in this particular craft was as essential to the project as the skill of the masons who would follow them. The centering supported the arch's stones as they were set into place, one after another, following the curve the carpenters had built, each stone cut to a precise wedge shape called a voussoir, tapering so that its sides matched the angle required to transfer force properly into its neighbors. Only when the final stone, the keystone, had been lowered into position at the arch's crown could the centering be removed. And it was at this moment, when the wooden supports were struck away and the arch was left to bear its own weight for the first time, that the true test of the builder's geometry occurred, a moment of held breath translated into stone rather than words. Though no dramatic account of failure or success survives from most such moments, only the arches themselves, still standing, offering their own quiet testimony. Hoisting the stone into place required machinery that had been developed and refined over generations of Roman construction. Cranes built of timber and rope, powered by teams of men walking within great treadwheels that converted their steady effort into a controlled, gradual lift. These cranes could raise blocks of stone weighing many hundreds of pounds to heights that, in some of the grander aqueducts, exceeded the height of a modern 6-story building. and the operation required not only mechanical ingenuity, but also careful coordination among the men on the ground who guided the stone's ascent, the men in the treadwheel who supplied its motive force, and the masons waiting above who would receive the block and settle it precisely into the waiting gap in the arch's curve. This work proceeded arch by arch, pier by pier, across the valley floor, and the pace was necessarily slow, for stone could not be rushed into place without risking the alignment upon which the entire structure's strength depended. And so the arcade rose not in a matter of weeks, but across seasons, sometimes across years. The workforce moving steadily along the valley as one arch after another joined its neighbours in an unbroken procession toward the far hillside. What resulted, when the arcade was finally complete and the temporary wooden centerings had all been removed, was a structure whose visual effect on those who witnessed its construction and on those who saw it afterward for the first time must have been considerable, though few written accounts survive to describe that reaction in detail. A line of arches marching across a valley, uniform in height, uniform in span, repeating with a rhythm that suggested less the work of individual hands than the operation of some vast and disciplined will, communicated something about the authority that had commissioned it that no speech or inscription could equal. To stand at the base of such an arcade, looking upward at piers that rose taller than any building most people of the ancient world would ever enter, and to know that this entire towering structure existed for the sole purpose of carrying a channel of water no wider than a modern doorway, was to encounter a demonstration of resource and resolve that few other works of the ancient world could match. The aqueduct arcades were not fortifications built to intimidate an enemy, nor were they temples built to honor a god. They were, in their essential purpose, plumbing, elevated to a scale and a permanence that transformed ordinary infrastructure into something that could inspire the same quiet awe that a cathedral or a mountain might inspire. And this transformation, from utility to grandeur, from function to monument, was perhaps the truest expression of what Roman engineering, at its most confident, understood itself to be capable of achieving. The arches that rose across these valleys did not announce themselves through decoration or inscription in the way a triumphal arch might. And yet their scale alone carried a kind of rhetoric, a wordless argument for the permanence and reach of the power that had built them. An argument the valley's arcade would continue to make for as long as its stones remained standing. Nowhere does that argument stand more completely than at the crossing of the garden, where the river cuts its slow path between limestone hills in the south of what is now France, and where the men who carried water toward Nemours built the structure that would come to stand, in the minds of later centuries, for the whole of Roman engineering itself. The Pont du Gard, as it would come to be called long after the empire that raised it had receded into memory, was never intended as a monument. It was a single link in a channel some 50 kilometres long, carrying water from a spring near Uzès to the growing city of Nemours. And in the accounting of the engineers who designed it, it was simply the answer to a particular problem of terrain, the crossing of a valley that the aqueduct's gentle, unrelenting gradient could not avoid. But the answer they built has outlasted almost everything else the system once contained. And it has done so not by accident, but by a precision so exacting that the stones themselves seem to resist the passage of time. The structure rises in 3 tiers, each set of arches smaller and more numerous than the one beneath it, the whole composition narrowing as it climbs, so that the eye is drawn upward along a rhythm of repeated curves toward the narrow channel at the very top, the spicus through which the water once ran. The lowest tier carries the roadway across the river on 6 great arches, broad and heavy, built to withstand the periodic violence of the garden in flood. Above this rises a second tier, echoing the first in its proportions but lighter in its massing, and above that again a long colonnade of smaller arches, some 35 in number, marching across the top of the valley to carry the covered channel itself. The whole rises to a height of nearly 50 meters above the river at its lowest point, and stretches some 275 meters from hillside to hillside, a scale that even now, encountered without warning by a traveler coming down through the dry hills of Provence, tends to silence conversation. What draws engineers and historians back to this structure again and again, however, is not simply its height or its length, but the manner of its construction. For the Pont du Gard was raised, in significant part, without mortar. The great stone blocks of its lower tiers, some of them weighing as much as 6 tons, were cut to such fine tolerances that they could be set directly against one another and held in place by friction and by their own careful arrangement. The pressure of the arch above bearing down and locking each stone against its neighbours. Where mortar was used at all, it appears to have served secondary purposes, filling small gaps or bonding certain courses, rather than functioning as the primary adhesive holding the structure together. The bridge, in a very real sense, stands today because it was never truly stuck together at all. It was fitted, block against block, with a precision that left almost no room for slippage or settling, and it has settled remarkably little in the 2,000 years since it was raised. The stone itself came from a quarry a short distance away, a local limestone that the builders learned to read and to trust, understanding through long practice which beds of rock would split cleanly and which would carry weight without fracturing under the compressive loads an arch imposes on its voussoir. Each block for the arches was cut as a wedge, wider at the top than at the bottom, so that the entire ring of stones composing an arch would lock into a self-supporting curve the moment the last keystone was set and the wooden centering beneath it removed. This was not a new technique. Roman builders had used it for generations by the time the Pont du Gard was raised. What set this structure apart was the discipline with which the technique was applied, across such an enormous span, arch after arch, tier after tier, each one cut with a consistency that suggests either an extraordinarily skilled and well-organized workforce, or a set of templates and gauges so carefully standardized that individual variation in the stonecutter's hands was reduced to almost nothing. Likely, the truth involves both. Skilled masons working from patterns that left little to individual interpretation, checked and rechecked against wooden or iron templates as each block came off the quarry face and was shaped for its place in the arcade. The purpose this bridge served was, in the end, entirely practical, and it is worth pausing on how strange that practicality would have seemed to later observers who mistook the structure, for centuries, as a work of pure ambition rather than function. The aqueduct of which the Pont du Gard formed a single crossing was built to supply Nemours, a city of moderate size by the standards of the wider empire, with water for its baths, its fountains, its private houses of means, and the public basins that served ordinary residents throughout the town. The entire course of the channel, from spring to city, descended across its full length by a total of only about 17 meters, an average gradient so gentle that engineers examining the surviving sections in later centuries expressed something close to disbelief that surveyors working without modern instruments could have achieved it with such consistency. At the Pont du Gard itself, the drop across the entire 275-meter crossing amounted to only a few centimeters, a gradient so slight that the eye cannot perceive it at all. And yet the water moved, steadily, continuously, carried by nothing but the patient logic of falling elevation across 50 kilometres of hills, valleys, tunnels, and bridges. The ambition represented by this single crossing, then, was not the ambition of spectacle, but the ambition of consistency, the willingness to solve one difficult valley in exactly the same rigorous manner as 100 easier stretches of open ground, because the whole system would fail if any single section broke the unbroken descent the water required. It is this insistence on solving the hard problem with the same care as the easy ones that gives the Pont du Gard its particular character among Roman ruins. For it does not represent a moment of unusual daring, so much as a moment of unusual necessity. A place where the ordinary standards of aqueduct construction happen to demand extraordinary height and mass simply because the valley beneath it happened to be so wide and so deep. Much about the specific circumstances of its construction remains genuinely uncertain, and it is worth resisting the temptation, as later centuries did not always resist, to fill those gaps with confident invention. The date of construction is generally placed in the 1st century of the Common Era, likely during the reign of Claudius or shortly after, though the archaeological and inscriptional evidence permits only an approximate range rather than a fixed year, and some scholars have argued for a somewhat earlier or later date based on details of masonry style and regional building chronology. The identity of the engineer or engineers who designed the crossing is not recorded in any surviving document. Later tradition attached the name of Agrippa to the aqueduct's origins, given his known association with the water supply of Nemosus and other western provincial cities. But the specific attribution of this bridge to his personal direction cannot be confirmed and is treated by careful historians as a plausible but unproven association rather than an established fact. The size of the workforce, similarly, can only be estimated. Scholars examining the volume of stone moved, the pace at which similar Roman structures were typically raised, and the logistical demands of quarrying, transporting, and setting blocks of this scale have suggested a labor force numbering perhaps in the several hundreds to over 1,000 workers at the height of construction, sustained over a building period that may have lasted as little as 3 years or considerably longer, depending on which reconstruction of the timeline one finds most persuasive. No detailed payroll or construction record survives to settle the question, and the estimates offered by different researchers have varied enough that the honest position remains one of informed uncertainty rather than settled fact. What can be said with more confidence is that a project of this scale would have required organization across multiple trades: quarrymen, cutters, haulers, scaffolders, and masons, coordinated over months and years in a manner that left no individual name behind, only the collective evidence of the stones themselves. The cost of the whole aqueduct system, expressed in terms a modern reader could easily translate, is likewise not preserved in any surviving account specific to this stretch of construction. Though general estimates for major Roman aqueduct projects elsewhere suggest sums that would have represented a substantial civic investment, underwritten most likely by a combination of imperial patronage, local civic funds, and the wealth of prominent citizens eager to see their city's water supply and their own reputations secured for generations. Whatever the true figures, the willingness to commit such resources to a single provincial water system speaks to how seriously the empire treated the ordinary comforts of daily life as matters worthy of extraordinary engineering. Today the channel is dry, the water long ago diverted, silted and abandoned as the city it served changed shape and drew its supply from other sources across the intervening centuries. The spicus at the top of the bridge, once lined with a coating meant to keep the flowing water pure and swift, now stands open to the sky, weathered and empty. Visitors walk beneath the great arches where farmers once herded goats through the shade, where the river still moves below much as it always has, indifferent to the stone standing above it. The bridge has lost some of its facing here and there, has been repaired and reinforced at various points across the centuries, by hands far removed from those of its original builders, and yet the essential structure, tier upon tier, arch after fitted arch, remains substantially the shape it was when the last stone was set in place. It stands now neither as ruin nor as relic exactly, but as something closer to a held breath, stone resting patiently against stone, waiting on tolerances cut 2,000 years ago that have not yet, even now, been asked to fail. All of this labor, all of this patient carrying of water across valleys and along contour lines cut into hillsides, found its purpose not in the countryside through which the channels passed, but in the city waiting at the end of them. Rome itself, by the time its aqueducts had multiplied across the centuries, was fed by a system whose scale is difficult to hold in the mind even now. The Aqua Marcia, completed in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, carried water gathered from springs some 60 miles distant, much of it flowing underground through channels cut into rock and only rising onto arches in its final approach to the city, where the ground fell away and the water needed height to keep its promised gradient. The Aqua Claudia, begun under one emperor and finished under another, arrived on some of the tallest arcades the Romans ever built, its arches marching for miles across the plain outside the city before delivering their water to reservoirs on the hills within. And running alongside it, sharing many of the same piers, the Anio Novus carried water from even farther away, drawn high in the mountains where the river ran cold and rich with silt, water that would need long rest in settling basins before the city would accept it as clean. By the height of the empire, Rome was fed by 11 aqueducts in all, their channels crossing and recrossing one another in the countryside, sometimes carried on the same arcade, one channel stacked above another, so that a single line of arches might be delivering the output of 2 or 3 separate systems at once, gathered from separate springs, separate rivers, separate mountains, and brought together only in their final approach to the city that needed them all. What arrived at Rome's edge was not yet water fit for a household or a fountain. It arrived, more often than not, as water still carrying the memory of its journey, cloudy with fine sediment picked up in its passage through soft ground, warmed or cooled according to the season, and it had first to be settled and cleared before the city would trust it to its basins. This work happened largely out of sight, in structures called piscinae limariae, settling tanks built at the point where a channel entered the city's higher ground. Wide, shallow basins where the water's motion slowed, and the sediment it carried was given time to fall away before the cleared water was drawn off, from a point above the settled silt and sent onward into the city proper. From these settling basins, the water passed into the castella, the distribution tanks that formed the true beating organs of the system, structures that in some cases still stand today, their thick walls and channeled floors bearing witness to how carefully the flow leaving them was managed. The largest of these, the castellum at the terminus of a major aqueduct, might divide its incoming stream into a dozen or more separate outflows, each cut to a particular width and set at a particular height in the tank's wall, so that the amount of water any given channel received was fixed not by whim, but by the simple physical constraint of an opening's size, measured in Roman inches, a system called the calyx, a formal bronze fitting installed at the point where a private or public pipe left the main distribution point. From these primary castella, secondary and tertiary distribution points carried the water onward through the city's grid of buried pipes, most of them made of lead, some of terracotta, branching and branching again until the water that had begun its journey 60 miles away in a spring above a mountain valley emerged at last from a public fountain on a street corner, or filled the basin of a bathhouse, or rose through a private pipe into the courtyard of a wealthy household. It is here, in this final distribution, that the aqueducts reveal something beyond their engineering, something closer to the shape of Roman society itself. Frontinus, who served as the curator aquarum, the official responsible for Rome's water supply near the end of the 1st century, left behind a detailed accounting of exactly how the city's water was allocated, and his figures show a system that was at once remarkably public and quietly stratified. A significant share of the total flow, by his account, was directed to public uses that required no payment at all. Public fountains standing on nearly every street, from which any resident of the city, however poor, could draw water freely with a jug or a bucket. Public baths, some of them free to enter, and others charging only a token fee, open to men and women of every station at different hours of the day. And the great public works themselves, the fountains feeding ornamental basins in the fora, the water used to flush the city's sewers, the supply reserved for the naval displays, sometimes staged in flooded arenas. This portion of the flow was, in a real sense, common property, water that fell as rain in distant mountains and arrived in the city as a kind of civic inheritance available to anyone who lived within reach of a public spout. But alongside this public allocation ran another stream entirely, water granted by imperial permission to private households, a privilege that had to be petitioned for, paid for, and maintained through ongoing fees, and which was granted in quantities measured out in those same fixed units, controlled by the calyx at the point of distribution. To hold a private grant of water was to hold something close to a mark of status, a visible sign that one's household had secured, through wealth or influence or both, a private thread from the same system that fed the public fountains everyone else relied upon. The wealthy did not merely have more water, they had water delivered directly into their own courtyards and gardens, water that filled private baths without the need to walk to a public one, water that fed household fountains built purely for pleasure, their basins carved with dolphins and shells, water spilling for no purpose but to be seen and heard spilling. Frontinus himself, in the course of his duties, uncovered widespread abuse of this system. Pipes illegally tapped before they reached their registered destination, calices swapped out for wider ones than had been officially granted, plumbers bribed to divert water to gardens and estates never listed on any official register. The water, in other words, was policed as carefully as it was engineered, because everyone understood that access to it carried weight far beyond simple thirst. And yet, for all this stratification at the level of private grants, the public fountains remained genuinely public, and it is here that something like an equalizing force can still be felt in what survives of Roman daily life. An inscription found near one such fountain, a lex written into stone regulating conduct at a public water source in a Roman town, warns those who come to draw water against fouling the basin, against washing clothing or animals in the water meant for drinking, against lingering too long when others are waiting their turn. Small, practical rules that only make sense if we imagine the scene they were meant to govern. A crowd gathering at dawn and again in the evening, servants sent by wealthy households standing in the same line as poor tenants from the upper floors of a crowded insula, buckets and jars knocking against the stone lip of the basin. Gossip passed back and forth in the time it took water to fill a container, children sent on errands, old men resting on the fountain's edge before continuing home. The poet Martial, writing in the same period Frontinus served as water commissioner, complains more than once of neighbors who drew water noisily before sunrise, waking him with the clatter of jars against stone, a small domestic irritation that nonetheless tells us something true, that the public fountain was woven into the ordinary rhythm of a Roman day as thoroughly as bread or bathing, a place where rich and poor alike, if only briefly, occupied the same stretch of pavement and drew from the same channel of water, even if the wealthy among them would return afterward to households already supplied through private pipes of their own. Water, in this way, ran through Roman society exactly as it ran through the city's stone and lead, dividing as it flowed, offered freely at one point and jealously guarded at another. Common property and private privilege carried, remarkably, within the very same channel. A system built to divide water so precisely and to carry it so far could not simply be left to run once it was finished. somewhere behind every fountain, every bath, every private pipe disappearing into the wall of a wealthy house. There had to exist a structure of human oversight nearly as extensive as the channels themselves, an invisible aqueduct of paperwork, inspection, and law running parallel to the visible one of stone. The Romans understood this, and in time they gave the task a name and an office. The curator aquarum, the commissioner of the waters, stood at the head of this quieter apparatus, charged with the maintenance of every channel entering the city, the punishment of those who stole from it, and the slow, unglamorous work of keeping something enormous from failing by degrees. It was not a position that produced monuments. It produced records, schedules, and rulings, and it is largely because of one man who held this office and who thought to write down what he found there that anything at all is known today about how the system was actually kept alive. That man was Sextus Julius Frontinus, appointed curator aquarum toward the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, a former provincial governor and military officer who arrived at the position, by his own account, with no particular expertise in hydraulics and a genuine surprise at how little had been written about a system so vital to the life of the city he now had to administer. He resolved, in the manner of a careful administrator inheriting an unfamiliar office, to learn it thoroughly, and the result of that effort survives as one of the most extraordinary technical documents to come down from the ancient world. A treatise now known as De Aqueductu, or On the Aqueducts of Rome. Written not as literature or as a monument to his own tenure, but as a working manual, part history, part legal reference, part engineer's notebook, intended as much for his successors in the office as for any wider readership. In it, Frontinus set down the origin and length of each aqueduct, then supplying the city, the gradients and capacities as best they could be measured, the legal penalties for tampering with the channels, and the precise allocations of water granted to public uses, to private citizens, and to the emperor's own household. He wrote of measuring the flow at various points along a channel, and finding, to his evident irritation, that the water arriving in Rome was consistently less than the water known to have entered the system upstream. A discrepancy he attributed correctly to a combination of leakage, poor calibration of the bronze pipes used to measure and distribute flow, and outright theft along the way. It is a document without ornament, written by a man who seems to have taken more satisfaction in solving a discrepancy of measurement than in any literary flourish. And it remains, nearly 2,000 years later, the clearest surviving window into how the Roman aqueduct system was actually run day to day, rather than how it was merely built. What Frontinus found, and what his treatise makes plain, is that the greatest threat to the aqueducts was rarely dramatic. It was not, in the ordinary run of things, an earthquake or a war or a sudden catastrophic collapse of an arcade, though all of these occurred at various points across the centuries. It was smaller and more persistent than that, a slow erosion carried out by nature, negligence and greed, operating continuously, in parallel, along every mile of channel the system possessed. Tree roots, seeking moisture, would find their way through the smallest crack in a covered channel's masonry and widen it patiently over years until a section gave way. Silt and mineral deposits, carried in suspension by the water itself, settled along the floor and walls of the conduits and had to be periodically chipped away, a process that left thick calcified linings in some speakers that survive and can still be measured today, offering historians and engineers alike a rough physical record of how many decades a given channel operated between major cleanings. Leaks developed at joints, at the seams between sections built by different crews in different seasons, at points where earlier repairs had themselves grown old and begun to fail in turn. And running beneath all of this, more troubling to a curator like Frontinus than any purely physical decay, was the persistent human habit of tapping into the channels illegally. a practice apparently common enough among both private citizens and, more troublingly, among the plumbari and other workmen who had privileged access to the system in the course of their legitimate duties. A landowner whose property lay near an aqueduct's route might quietly bore into the side of a channel to divert a small, unauthorized stream toward his own fields or fish ponds, betting that the loss would go unnoticed against the vast volume flowing past. A dishonest official responsible for issuing formal grants of water, called by the term frontinus uses, might record more modest allocations on paper than the pipes he had actually installed for a paying client. Multiplied across a city of 1 million people and a system stretching across hundreds of miles, these small thefts amounted, in aggregate, to a serious loss, and Frontinus devotes considerable attention in his treatise to the legal remedies available against them, the fines prescribed by earlier senatorial decrees, and the practical difficulty of enforcement across a network too vast for any single official to personally observe. Against all of this stood the maintenance crews, a body of workmen whose organization Frontinus describes with the particular care of a man who understood that skilled and available labor, more than any decree, was what actually kept water flowing. These crews were divided by task and by employer. Some maintained at public expense under the direct authority of the curator's office, others retained under a separate arrangement dating to the era of Augustus, when a wealthy patron had left a permanent fund and a body of slaves specifically for aqueduct upkeep, an arrangement later absorbed into imperial administration but still remembered by name in Frontinus's own account. Among their number were the men called circuitores, whose task was to walk the length of assigned sections of channel on a regular schedule, inspecting for cracks, blockages, illegal taps, and any sign of the encroaching vegetation or subsidence that might, left unaddressed, become a serious failure. Others specialized in the clearing of silt from the settling tanks built at intervals along each aqueduct's route, in the repair of masonry along exposed arcades, in the replacement of failed sections of lead or bronze pipe within the city itself, and in the emergency response required when a break did occur and water needed to be diverted or shut off entirely while repairs were made. All of this labor, dispersed across a system whose full length exceeded, when every branch and distribution line is counted, several hundred miles, was coordinated through record-keeping of a thoroughness that would not have disgraced a modern utility. Logs of inspections performed, repairs completed, allocations granted, and violations discovered, maintained not for any antiquarian interest, but because a curator arriving new to the office, as Frontinus himself had, needed some means of understanding a system too large to hold entirely in memory. It is a striking thing to consider, in an age remembered popularly for its arches and its concrete, that so much of what actually sustained the aqueducts of Rome across the centuries was not stone at all, but paper, and the discipline of the men who kept it. There is a temptation, when admiring the physical remains of Roman engineering, to treat the arcades and tunnels as the whole of the achievement and the administrative apparatus behind them as a mere afterthought, necessary but unremarkable, the bureaucratic residue of a more genuinely impressive feat of construction. Frontinus's treatise argues gently against this view simply by existing, and by the evident care with which it was composed. The channels themselves, however precisely graded, however skillfully vaulted or tunneled, would have silted, cracked, and failed within a generation without a sustained human institution dedicated to their observation and repair. An institution that had to be renewed constantly, in the persons of new curators, new circuitores, new clerks recording new allocations. Across centuries in which emperors rose and fell, wars were fought at the empire's edges, and the city above the channels changed almost beyond recognition. In this sense, the office of the curator aquarum and the quieter labor of inspection and record it oversaw deserves to be understood as a form of engineering in its own right, no less deliberate in its design than the gradient of a channel or the mixture of a batch of Roman concrete, and considerably more difficult to sustain since stone, once properly laid, requires no further will to remain standing, while an institution requires that will renewed in every generation that inherits it. That the water continued to fall, gently, mile after mile, into the fountains and baths of Rome for century after century, owes as much to this durable bureaucracy of measurement and correction as it does to the arches that carried it, a fact Frontinus seems to have understood in his own careful and unadorned way, better than almost anyone who came after him. There were places, however, where no bureaucracy of measurement and no elegance of gradient could substitute for the plain fact of stone in the way. And it is here, in the hills that could not be walked around, that the aqueduct builders faced a problem no arch could solve. An arch carries water over open ground, across a valley, above a river, through the air where nothing obstructs the path but empty space. A mountain offers no such courtesy. It sits directly across the line that gradient demands, a solid mass of rock and earth that cannot be bridged, only entered, and the builders who reached these places had no choice but to go into the hill itself, cutting a channel through solid stone where the surveyors had determined the water must go, whether or not the ground agreed. The decision to tunnel was never taken lightly, for a tunnel consumed far more labor, far more time, and far more uncertainty than even the tallest bridge of arches. An arcade could be seen as it rose, its progress measured plainly against the sky, its faults visible to any eye that cared to look. A tunnel offered no such visibility. It was cut blind, advancing inch by inch into rock whose composition could not be known in advance, whose hardness might change without warning from soft and workable stone to something that resisted the pick for days at a stretch, and whose interior, once the diggers had gone more than a few dozen feet from the entrance, admitted no natural light at all. The work went forward by lamp and by touch, in air that grew steadily more foul as the tunnel lengthened, and the smoke of the lamps themselves accumulated with nowhere to escape. And every foot gained was a foot won against darkness in the most literal sense the word allows. The techniques the Romans used to manage this problem were not, in their origins, Roman at all, though the Romans adapted and extended them with characteristic thoroughness. Long before the empire reached its greatest extent, the peoples of Persia and the arid stretches of the Near East had developed a method of underground water conveyance known by a name that has survived into modern usage. The kanat, a horizontal tunnel driven gently downhill from a source of water toward the fields and settlements that needed it. Its course marked and its construction guided by a line of vertical shafts sunk down from the surface at intervals along its length. These shafts served several purposes at once, purposes so practical and so enduring that the Roman engineers, encountering similar problems of underground conveyance in their own territories, adopted essentially the same solution, calling the shafts by their own word, puttae, the same term used for ordinary wells, though these wells served no household and drew no water for daily use. Their function was entirely bound up with the tunnel beneath them. A vertical shaft, sunk from the surface down to the level of the planned channel, accomplished several things simultaneously, and it is worth pausing over each of them, since together they explain how work that seems, from a modern vantage point, almost impossibly difficult, was in fact rendered manageable through a method of considerable ingenuity. First, and most obviously, the shaft provided a point of access, a way down into the workings that did not require walking the entire length of the tunnel from one distant end. Second, it provided ventilation, a chimney through which foul air could rise, and, if the diggers were fortunate and the shafts were spaced closely enough, through which some measure of fresh air could descend to replace it. Though the sources make clear that in the worst tunnels, in the tunnels driven deepest and longest between shafts, the men working at the advancing face laboured in air that grew thick and difficult to breathe, and lamps guttered low for want of anything to feed the flame. Third, and perhaps most critically for the pace of the work, the shaft provided a means of removing spoil, the broken rock and loosened earth that accumulated at the tunnel face, and that would otherwise have had to be hauled the full length of the workings to an exit. Instead, baskets of debris could be hoisted up the nearest shaft, a journey of perhaps 60 or 80 feet rather than half a mile, and the labour of clearing the tunnel, which might otherwise have consumed as much time as the digging itself, was reduced to something merely arduous rather than something impossible. The shafts also served, and this detail deserves particular attention, as a means of establishing and correcting direction for a line of poutais sunk from the surface at measured intervals, each one positioned according to the surveyor's calculations of where the tunnel beneath ought to run, gave the diggers a series of fixed points to work toward. A crew advancing underground from one shaft could aim, quite literally, for the shaft ahead, guided perhaps by a plumb line dropped down from above, or by sightings taken with the groma or a similar instrument set up at the surface opening, its alignment checked and rechecked against the placement of the shaft behind and the one anticipated ahead. In this way, a tunnel that might run for a mile or more beneath a mountain was not dug as a single continuous blind guess, but as a series of shorter, more manageable segments, each one connecting two known points. The accumulated error at any moment limited to the distance between one Putius and the next, rather than compounding across the entire unseen length of the passage. None of this diminishes the sheer physical danger of the work, and it would be a disservice to the men who performed it to suggest that ingenious method rendered the labour safe. The rock through which these tunnels passed was not uniform, and a seam of loose or fractured stone, invisible from the surface and unpredictable even to an experienced digger, could give way without warning, burying men beneath a fall of debris that no lamp, however bright, would have illuminated in time to matter. The air, as already noted, grew foul with distance from the nearest shaft, and there is little reason to doubt that some workers succumbed not to a sudden collapse, but to a slower suffocation, a gradual thinning of breathable air that dulled the mind before it stopped the body, a hazard that would have been recognized, if imperfectly understood in its mechanism, by every foreman who sent men deep into a working face, far from the nearest opening to daylight. Water was a hazard as well, for a tunnel driven through rock might intersect an unsuspected spring or a pocket of groundwater, and the sudden flooding of a working face, though it served the eventual purpose of the aqueduct rather well once channeled, was no comfort at all to the men caught in the passage when the water first broke through. Against all of this, the workers had only lamplight, whatever oil could be carried down the shaft or along the tunnel floor, and the accumulated experience of men who had done this work before and passed its lessons down, since there existed no written manual. So far as the record shows, that could have substituted for a foreman's memory of what a groaning timber support or a subtle change in the colour of the rock face might portend. Given all of this, the achievement that most astonishes those who study these tunnels today is not that they were built at all, remarkable as that is, but that two crews, digging from opposite ends of a mountain and guided only by the surveying instruments and mathematical methods available in the 1st century, could meet underground, in the dark, at a point calculated in advance, with an accuracy that modern engineers, working with laser levels and satellite positioning, still find difficult to entirely explain. The tunnel at the source of the Aqua Claudia, and more famously the tunnel built at Saldai in North Africa, provide the clearest documented instances of this practice, the latter recorded in an inscription that tells its own story of near failure and eventual triumph. For at Saldai the two crews, digging toward each other from opposite faces of a hill, very nearly missed one another entirely, their lines diverging enough that the local governor summoned an engineer named Nonius Datus to investigate what had gone wrong. And Datus's account, terse and practical, describes his arrival to find the workers disheartened and the project on the verge of abandonment, and his subsequent recalculation of the alignment, which allowed the two headings to be corrected and finally joined. That the inscription records the difficulty at all is itself instructive, since it reminds us that these underground meetings did not always succeed on the first attempt, and that the confidence later observers might feel in Roman surveying should be tempered by the honest record of at least one occasion when it nearly failed. Yet in the cases where the method succeeded, and there are several, the precision achieved remains genuinely difficult to account for, using only the instruments known to have been available, chiefly the groma for establishing right angles and straight lines, and the chorobates, a long leveling instrument fitted with a water channel along its upper surface for establishing horizontal planes against which slopes could be measured. Neither instrument on its own explains how a surveyor, standing on a hillside, could calculate, with the accuracy the archaeological evidence demonstrates, the exact point deep within the rock where two tunnels driven from opposite directions ought to converge. Modern engineers who have studied these tunnels, tracing their courses with contemporary surveying equipment and comparing the results against the ancient work, have generally concluded that the Romans achieved this precision through a combination of careful triangulation from surface points, repeated verification using the shafts themselves as checkpoints, and an accumulated practical skill in surveying that the surviving instruments alone do not fully capture, a skill perhaps passed down through practice and correction in ways the written record was never designed to preserve. The puzzle is not entirely solved even now, and there remains something appropriate in that. A reminder that the water flowing gently downhill through these mountain passages carried with it not only the certainty of gradient, but also a measure of skill that has outlasted, in its particulars, the full understanding of those who now study its results. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the system that had begun as a single channel carrying water from a modest spring into an early Rome had become something far larger than any one city, though the city remained its heart and its reason. 11 aqueducts by then reached into Rome itself, their combined length, when every channel and branch and distribution pipe is counted together, running to some 400 miles of construction, most of it hidden below the ground. Only a small portion of it raised into the arcades that later centuries would come to think of as the whole of the achievement. It is worth pausing on that proportion because it corrects an impression that persists even now. The image most often called to mind of tall stone arches marching across open country represents only a narrow slice of the actual work. The greater part of every aqueduct's length lay buried, following the contour of hills, cut through where the ground demanded it, carried on low walls where the ground allowed it, and lifted onto arcades only where no other path could be found. The visible grandeur was the exception. The buried channel was the rule, and yet it was the exception that endured most visibly into later ages, so that the popular memory of Roman water came to rest on its most theatrical expression rather than its most typical one. The daily volume delivered by this network, calculated from the sizes of the channels themselves and the recorded specifications that survive, has been estimated in various figures depending on the assumptions used. But even the more conservative estimates describe an amount of water arriving in ancient Rome each day that would not be matched again by any city on Earth for well over 1,000 years. Modern reconstructions vary, and scholars continue to debate the precision of ancient measurements of flow, since the Romans lacked a means of measuring volume directly, and instead worked from the cross-sectional area of the channel and an estimate of velocity, a method with acknowledged uncertainty even to those who practiced it in antiquity. But whatever the exact figure, the broad picture holds. The water arriving daily was enough, by any calculation, to supply every public fountain, every bath complex, every imperial garden, and still leave a portion for the private connections that wealthier households were permitted to hold, at a price, under license, subject to the same scrutiny that Frontinus would later apply so thoroughly to the system's management. This abundance reshaped the city's daily life in ways that a modern observer, accustomed to water arriving invisibly through walls and under floors, may find difficult to fully picture. Public fountains stood on street corners throughout every district, drawing a value the Romans called aquinaria in their own units of measurement, spelled out here as it was written, and these fountains ran continuously, day and night, without taps or valves to interrupt them, the excess simply flowing onward through drains and back into the city's sewers rather than being stored or shut off. Water in Rome was not something to be conserved through the day. It was something to be enjoyed as a constant, ambient presence, heard before it was seen, a soft sound of falling water present in nearly every part of the city at nearly every hour, so common that a resident of ancient Rome likely ceased to notice it, much as a modern city dweller ceases to notice traffic. The great bath complexes that rose across the city through the 1st and 2nd centuries depended entirely on this abundance. The baths of Caracalla, completed in the early 3rd century, and the baths of Diocletian, built not long after, were structures of enormous scale, capable of holding many thousands of bathers across their halls and pools, their furnaces burning day and night to heat the water passing through their systems of pipes and channels. Such places could not have existed without a water supply of genuine reliability and volume, since a single failure in delivery would have meant not simply discomfort, but the closing of an institution that had become, by then, a central feature of Roman civic life, a place of exercise and conversation, and business as much as bathing. The aqueducts made this possible in a way no local well or cistern ever could have. And beyond the baths, the water-fed ornamental fountains and monumental nymphaea, structures built purely for the pleasure of moving water, cascading over carved stone into basins for no purpose beyond delight and display, a use of resources that only a city confident in its abundance would permit itself. Sanitation, too, depended on this constant flow, the overflow from fountains and baths running onward through the streets, fed into the sewer system beneath the city, the Cloaca Maxima and its network of subsidiary channels, carrying waste away in a manner that few cities before or for centuries afterward could match. It would be an overstatement to describe ancient Rome as clean by modern standards, since crowding and disease remained constant companions to its population regardless of its engineering. But the volume of moving water passing through the city daily did provide a level of flushing and dilution that meaningfully reduced certain hazards, even if the Romans themselves understood this benefit only imperfectly, attributing the value of moving water more to a general sense of health and vigor than to any specific theory of contagion. What Rome achieved at its capital, it exported wherever its authority reached, and this is perhaps the quieter half of the story, the part less often pictured, but no less significant. In the Iberian Peninsula, the aqueduct of Segovia still stands, its arcade of granite blocks fitted without mortar, rising in 2 tiers across a valley, carrying water that once supplied the city below. Built to a design recognizably related to the arcades of Rome, yet adapted entirely to local stone and local terrain. In southern Gaul, the channel that fed the city of Nemosus, the modern Nimes, crossed the valley of the Gardon on the arcade now known as the Pont du Gard, a structure this account has already considered at length, but which stands here again simply as one example among many of a pattern repeated across the provinces. Wherever Roman administrators judged a city worthy of the investment. In North Africa, aqueducts fed the cities of Carthage and Caesarea. their channels running for considerable distances across terrain very different from the hills of Italy or the valleys of Gaul, adapted with the same patient attention to gradient and contour that had shaped the channels feeding Rome itself. In Asia Minor, the cities of the eastern provinces received their own aqueducts, some crossing valleys on arcades, others descending through inverted siphons of lead or stone pipe, where the terrain made a continuous gradient impossible, a solution the Romans understood and used when circumstance required it, even though they preferred gravity flow wherever a workable path could be found. Each of these provincial systems bore the unmistakable imprint of the same engineering tradition, the same insistence on gradient, the same patient surveying, the same construction in stone and concrete and lead. Yet each was also distinctly local, shaped by the particular hills and rivers and building stone available in its own region. This was, in a sense, the deeper meaning of the aqueduct as a Roman achievement. It was not simply a structure exported wholesale and stamped onto foreign ground without regard for what was already there. It was a method, a discipline, a way of reading a landscape and answering its demands, and that method proved adaptable enough to serve a granite valley in Iberia, a limestone gorge in Gaul, a coastal plain in North Africa, and a mountainous province in Asia Minor, each with its own solution, but all recognizably part of the same tradition. Wherever the Roman administration judged a city significant enough, water followed, carried according to principles that had been worked out first in Italy and then carried outward, along with law and language and coinage, as one of the enduring marks of what it meant to belong to the empire's world. It would be a disservice to this history, though, to speak of Rome's achievement as though it arose from nothing, as though no one before had thought to move water with patience and skill. The qanats of ancient Persia, built centuries before the first Roman aqueduct, carried water for great distances through gently sloping underground tunnels, drawing on groundwater in arid regions and delivering it across long distances entirely without the visible arcades that would later define the Roman image, a system of remarkable ingenuity that predates Rome's own efforts by a considerable span of time. The civilizations of Mesopotamia had built canals and channels to manage water for irrigation and settlement long before Rome existed, as more than a scattering of huts along the Tiber. Even within Italy itself, the Etruscans, whose engineering knowledge the early Romans absorbed and adapted more than they are often credited with doing, had practiced drainage and water management with real sophistication before Roman power extended beyond its own city. What Rome contributed was not the invention of moving water by gradient, an idea far older than Rome itself, but the scale at which it was pursued, the consistency with which it was administered, and the sheer geographic reach across which the same disciplined method was applied. From the hills of Italy to the deserts of Africa to the river valleys of Gaul, each place receiving not a copy of Rome, but an expression of a shared and portable engineering intelligence, carried wherever Roman authority extended its patient, gradual claim upon the land. That claim, patient and gradual as it was in its rising, proved just as gradual in its unmaking, though far less patient in the telling. For what took 4 centuries to build across an empire took only a handful of generations to fall into disrepair, once the hand that maintained it began to loosen its grip. The system had never been self-sustaining in the way its stone might suggest to a casual observer standing before an arcade that seemed, in its solidity, to promise permanence. Behind every channel that carried water without pause lay an administration of curators and inspectors, of slaves and freedmen assigned to walk the lines, of budgets allocated from the treasury of a city or a province, of legal statutes defining the penalties for damaging a conduit or diverting its flow without license. Water moved because people were paid, ordered, and organized to keep it moving. When that organization weakened, the water did not immediately stop, for stone does not know at once that its keepers have gone. But the slow accumulation of small failures began, each one unremarkable in itself. Each one the kind of thing an inspector walking the line would have caught and reported and repaired within a season, had there been an inspector, had there been a season's budget, had there been anyone left whose task it was to notice. The weakening came first in the provinces, as it so often does in systems that radiate outward from a centre. The furthest reaches losing attention before the capital itself begins to feel the cold. Across the 3rd century, as the empire strained under civil war, invasion, and the fracturing of central authority into rival claimants and short-lived emperors, the smaller cities of Gaul, of Britain, of the Danubian frontier found their local treasuries stretched thin or emptied, entirely by military demands that could not be refused. A city that once maintained its aqueduct as a matter of civic pride and imperial expectation now found itself choosing between paying tribute to a passing army and paying a work crew to clear silt from a channel 40 miles distant. The choice, when it had to be made, was rarely difficult and rarely recorded, for neglect leaves few documents behind. There is no triumphal inscription for the year a settling tank was left unemptied. No monument to the season a channel first ran slower than it had the year before. The silence in the historical record mirrors, in its own way, the silence that was beginning to settle over the channels themselves. Then came the deliberate act, which is a different thing entirely from neglect and darker in its intention. Aqueducts, precisely because they were so essential and so vulnerable, became instruments of war long before they became ruins of peace. A besieging army, understanding that a city's water was its lifeblood as surely as its grain, would seek out the aqueduct's course beyond the walls, where it ran exposed across open country, or crossed a valley on arches that no defender could easily protect. And there the besiegers would break it, sometimes with fire, sometimes by simply prying open the channel and letting the water spill uselessly into the fields, denying it to the city no matter how the siege itself resolved. Rome had done this to others in its centuries of conquest, and in time, Rome received the same treatment in return. During the wars of the 6th century, as Gothic armies and the forces of the Byzantine general Belisarius contested the city, the aqueducts that had sustained Rome for 600 years and more became a battlefield in themselves. The Goths, besieging the city, cut the channels feeding it, understanding precisely what such an act would mean for a population still numbering in the tens of thousands, a population accustomed to fountains running day and night, to baths open on public schedule, to a supply so abundant that waste itself had been a kind of civic ritual. The record from those years, thin and fragmentary as it is, suggests that once the aqueducts were severed, the mills that ground the city's grain, many of them powered by the same aqueduct water, as it fell through the city on its way to the river, fell silent as well. And bread became scarcer even as thirst grew sharper. Some channels were later patched, hurriedly, with materials far less durable than the stone and cement of the original builders. But the age of continuous, empire-wide maintenance was already ending, and each new rupture found fewer hands available to mend it, and less certainty that mending was even worth the effort when the city being served held only a fraction of the population it once had. What followed across the collapsing frontier of the Western Empire and within Rome itself was a silence unlike any the aqueducts had known before. It was not the silence of a channel resting between construction and completion, the patient quiet before water was first admitted. It was the silence of abandonment, settling in gradually, arch by arch, span by span, where a channel had once carried a continuous voice of moving water, day and night, season upon season. Now there came only the occasional drip of rain finding its way through a cracked vault, or the dry scrape of wind through an empty conduit that had once been full. The great speakers, the covered channels that had run for scores of miles beneath fields and hills, began to fill with wind-blown soil, with the roots of plants that found purchase in the settling cement, with the slow accretion of neglect that within a century could render a channel unrecognizable as the precise, level, engineered surface it had once been. Above ground, the arcades that had marched across valleys in unbroken rhythm began to lose their coping stones first, the small capping elements that shed rainwater from the exposed top of the channel. And once those were gone, water began to seep into the core of the structure itself, freezing in winter, expanding, cracking the facing stones loose in a process that, given a few centuries and no intervention, could bring down an arch that had stood secure through 500 years of continuous use. The populations that depended on this water responded as populations do when infrastructure fails. Not with immediate abandonment, but with a slow contraction, a withdrawal from the margins of what the water had once made possible. The great baths of Rome, which had required an almost unimaginable volume of water to operate on their old scale, one by one closed or reduced their operations. Some converted for other uses, others simply left to decay alongside the very channels that had fed them. The population of the city itself, which may have numbered close to 1 million at its height in the early empire, fell by some later estimates to perhaps 30,000 by the early medieval period. A contraction so severe that it is difficult now to grasp the scale of the change. And though the causes were many, war and plague and the collapse of the grain supply and the shift of imperial power eastward among them, the failure of the water system was both cause and consequence of that fall, feeding the decline even as it was hastened by it. A city so much smaller had far less need of the vast quantity of water the aqueducts had once delivered, and so even the channels that continued to function, in whole or in part, now served a fraction of their former purpose, their surplus running to waste through broken sections long since abandoned by any repair crew, back into the very earth and rivers from which the Roman engineers had first diverted it. And yet the story does not end in total silence, for water, once shown a course, does not easily forget it, and communities living among the ruins of the old system did not entirely surrender the advantage the Romans had given them. In the centuries that followed, medieval towns that had grown up in the shadow of a Roman arcade, or that occupied the same site as a Roman city, sometimes found it easier to patch a short, surviving stretch of ancient channel than to devise an entirely new supply from nothing. Local records from various parts of the former empire, in Italy, in Spain, in southern Gaul, describe piecemeal repairs undertaken not by any central authority, but by the town itself, a bishop, a local lord, or a communal council directing labor to clear a blocked stretch of channel or to prop a failing arch with new masonry laid in a style that any Roman engineer would have recognized as cruder, hastier, and far less confident than his own, yet serviceable enough to bring water into a much smaller town than the one the channel had originally served. Some of these repaired fragments continued to carry water for centuries more, not as the arteries of an empire, but as the modest, local lifelines of towns that had inherited, without fully understanding, the genius of a vanished administrative and engineering culture. It is worth pausing in the quiet of this decline to consider how swiftly a marvel of sustained human coordination can fall still once the attention that sustained it is withdrawn. The aqueducts were not conquered by any single catastrophe. No earthquake toppled them in an afternoon. No fire consumed them in a night. They fell because the 1,000 small acts of maintenance that had kept them alive, the yearly clearing of sediment, the inspection of joints, the replacement of worn stone, the vigilance against illegal taps and encroaching roots, ceased one by one, in different places at different times, for reasons as various as war, poverty, plague, and the slow reordering of where power and attention were spent. A system built to outlast centuries, and which in places did outlast centuries, nonetheless required every single day of its working life. The quiet, unglamorous labor of people whose names have mostly not survived, and when that labor stopped, the stone remained standing a while longer, indifferent and patient. But the water, which had never belonged to the stone in the first place, simply went elsewhere and found again the paths it had always known, before Rome ever thought to interrupt them. For a long while afterward, no one came looking. The arches that still stood did so without witnesses who understood what they had once carried, and the countryside around Rome and around every city the empire had touched absorbed them the way it absorbed everything else time had left behind. Farmers built against the piers. Shepherds sheltered flocks beneath the springing of arches that had once carried water 40 miles from a mountain spring to a fountain in a forum. In some places, the channels themselves, the spicus, were broken open and used as convenient troughs, or filled with rubble and forgotten entirely beneath a slow accumulation of soil and grass. The aqueducts did not vanish. They simply stopped being aqueducts in the minds of the people who lived among them, and became instead a kind of landscape feature, ancient and unexplained. The way a hill or a riverbed is unexplained, simply present, simply there before anyone now living could remember. It would be many centuries before anyone looked at these standing arches and asked, with any seriousness, what they had actually been for and how they had actually been built. The first to ask were not engineers, but antiquarians, men of curiosity and leisure in the 15th and 16th centuries, walking the Roman Campagna with notebooks and a kind of romantic hunger for the vanished world that Rome's ruins seemed to promise. They sketched the arches, they measured what they could reach, they copied inscriptions where inscriptions survived, often without fully understanding what they recorded, and they speculated, sometimes wildly, about how water had once moved, along channels that in most places no longer held any water at all. Their maps were imprecise, their conclusions often wrong, but they did something that mattered. They looked closely, and they wrote down what they saw, at a moment when more of the system remained visible than would remain visible later, after quarrying and building, and the slow erosion of centuries had taken further pieces away. It was not until the 18th and especially the 19th centuries that this looking became something closer to a discipline. Archaeology, still finding its methods, began to treat the aqueducts not as picturesque ruins, but as engineering records, texts written in stone and mortar that could, with patience, be read. Surveyors walked the presumed routes with levels and chains, tracing gradients across landscapes that had changed enormously since the channels were cut, noting where a line of vegetation followed an old buried course, where a village well drew from water that had once been captured for an aqueduct spring, where the ground itself preserved, in a slight and almost invisible swell or depression, the memory of a conduit no longer functioning beneath it. This was slow work, unglamorous work, closer to the patient tracing of an old scar than to the discovery of treasure, and it produced, over decades, maps of the Roman water system far more complete and far more accurate than anything the antiquarians had managed, though even these modern maps remained, in places, provisional, built from inference as much as from direct evidence, because so much of the system lay buried under later building, later roads, later cities that had grown up without regard for what lay beneath them. In this slow work of reconstruction, one document proved to be worth more than any other single source, and that was the treatise Sextus Julius Frontinus had written at the end of the 1st century, when he held the office of water commissioner and set himself to describing in careful and exhaustive detail the aqueducts under his charge. Frontinus had not written for the distant future. He had written, by his own account, to leave a clear record for those who would hold his office after him, so that the system might be managed honestly and competently, rather than left to guesswork or the self-serving claims of contractors. He listed the aqueducts by name. He gave their lengths, their sources, the proportion of their courses that ran underground against the proportion carried on arches. He described the standard measures of pipe, the legal penalties for tapping the supply without authorization, the recurring difficulties of maintenance, the frauds he had uncovered among the men responsible for distribution. None of this was written with an eye toward being read 2,000 years later by scholars trying to reconstruct a vanished infrastructure. And that absence of self-consciousness is part of what makes the document so valuable. Frontinus was not performing knowledge. He was recording it for practical use, and in doing so, he preserved details that no ruin, however well surveyed, could have supplied on its own. The names of aqueducts whose physical remains are fragmentary or ambiguous, the order in which they were built, the approximate scale of the whole system before certain branches were lost entirely to later building or destruction. When archaeologists in the modern era set about reconciling the physical evidence of arches and channels with the written record, it was Frontinus's treatise, more than any other single source, that gave them a framework to work within. Where a stretch of arcade could be found but its aqueduct could not be identified with certainty, Frontinus's list of names, sources, and lengths often allowed a plausible attribution. Where two aqueducts seemed to run improbably close together, his account of successive construction, one built decades or a century after another, explained why. Later builders had followed, wherever possible, alongside routes already surveyed and proven, rather than undertaking the harder work of finding an entirely new gradient across difficult ground. The treatise did not solve every puzzle. In many places, the physical remains have resisted precise correlation with his descriptions, and scholars continue to debate the exact courses of certain channels, especially where nothing above ground survives, and only Frontinus's brief mention preserves any evidence that a stretch existed at all. But without his account, the reconstruction of the system as a whole would have remained far more speculative than it has become, a scattering of stone fragments without the connective text that gives them meaning as a single, coherent, city-wide network. What survives today, physically, is uneven, and that unevenness is itself part of the story. Some stretches remain as dramatic ruin, arcades marching across open countryside with nothing before or after them, cut off at both ends by centuries of stone quarrying that treated the aqueducts as a convenient source of dressed material for other buildings. Other stretches have been restored, in whole or in part, by later governments eager to claim continuity with Roman engineering. Their masonry patched, and their arches shored up in ways that a careful eye can distinguish from the original fabric. Newer stone sitting slightly differently against older mortar of a different color and texture, marking the line between ancient work and modern repair. Still other fragments have been quietly absorbed into functioning infrastructure, their ancient channels repurposed, in places, to carry modern pipes, or their alignments followed by newer aqueducts built along the same gradients the Roman surveyors first identified. Because a good line, once found across difficult terrain, does not stop being a good line simply because the empire that found it has fallen. In this quiet way, some water in some modern cities still moves, in part along paths first laid out by men working with levels and sighting rods 2,000 years ago. A continuity almost invisible to anyone not looking for it, buried beneath asphalt and modern engineering, but real nonetheless. Modern engineers who have studied these remains in detail have tended, almost without exception, toward a particular kind of respect, one that has little to do with romance and everything to do with recognizing difficulty. They have measured the gradients the Roman surveyors achieved across miles of uneven country and found tolerances that would be respectable, even with instruments far more precise than a groma or a chorobates. They have examined the mortar, tested its composition, and found mixtures adapted with real sophistication to different conditions, some formulated to resist the slow, corrosive action of moving water, others suited to structural loads. The recipes varying by function in ways that suggest not trial and error alone, but an accumulated, transmitted body of practical knowledge, refined across generations of builders whose names are entirely lost. They have walked the tunnels cut through mountains and noted how closely two teams, digging from opposite ends without any way to check their progress against each other except calculation, managed to meet. And they have generally concluded that this was not luck, that it required a working understanding of geometry and measurement, sophisticated enough to plan an unseen meeting point deep inside solid rock, and then achieve it, using tools that, by comparison with the modern surveyor's instruments, seem almost primitively simple. The word that recurs most often in these professional assessments is not ingenious or clever, though the achievement is certainly both. The word that recurs is patient, and the closely related word disciplined, an achievement built less on brilliant flashes of insight than on sustained, careful, unglamorous attention, repeated across many years and many miles. Alongside this respect, though, real uncertainty remains, and honest scholarship has never pretended otherwise. The exact chronology of construction for several aqueducts is still debated, the written sources sometimes vague or contradictory about which emperor completed which stretch, and which merely repaired what an earlier ruler had begun. The number of laborers involved in any given project, free and enslaved together, is nowhere recorded with any precision that historians fully trust, and estimates offered by different scholars vary considerably, resting on inference from the scale of the work rather than on any surviving payroll or census. The exact costs, too, are largely lost, Frontinus himself more concerned with function than with expenditure, so that any modern figure for what a given aqueduct cost to build is, at best, an informed approximation drawn from comparable ancient building projects, and at worst, a guess dressed in the confident language of scholarship. These are not embarrassments. They are simply the honest edges of a body of knowledge reconstructed from fragments, written and physical both, across many centuries by people who never stopped finding, in the patient stone of these old channels, a discipline still worth the trouble of understanding. And perhaps that is the right note on which to let the story settle, because the aqueducts of Rome were never, in their own time, a subject of uncertainty. They were a subject of confidence, and the confidence rested on something so simple that it is easy to forget how much labor it took to make it useful. Water finds its way downward. That is the whole of the principle, the seed from which 400 miles of channel eventually grew across the width of an empire. No engine drove the water through the Aqua Marcia or the Aqua Claudia. No wheel turned to lift it over the plains south of Rome. It moved because the builders had arranged the world, mile after careful mile, so that it had nowhere else to go but forward and down, always down, by increments too small for the eye to register, but large enough, compounded across 10 miles or 40 or 80, to carry a river's worth of water from a spring in the hills to a basin inside the city walls. This was the whole of Roman hydraulic genius. In the end, not a mastery of forces unknown to other peoples, but a willingness to measure that small, patient decline with such discipline that it could be trusted across a distance where a single error, uncorrected, would have pooled the water uselessly against a bank 3 miles before its destination, or sent it crashing down a slope too steep for the channel to hold. Gravity did the labor. The surveyors and architects simply gave gravity a road to walk. It is worth sitting with that image a while longer, because it says something quiet about the whole civilization that built these channels, something that outlasts the empire itself, and the language it spoke, and the gods it prayed to. A people capable of laying out a gradient of a few inches per mile across 40 miles of uneven country, and holding to that gradient through hills that had to be tunneled, and valleys that had to be bridged, and marshes that had to be piled with foundations sunk deep into unstable ground, was a people who had made patience into a kind of technology. The gradient was not dramatic. It announced itself nowhere. A traveller walking beside the channel of the Aqua Claudia would have felt no sense of descent, would have seen no obvious slope, would have found the whole structure in its outward appearance almost stubbornly level. And yet the water inside was falling, always falling, degree by degree, mile by mile, toward Rome. The genius was hidden inside the ordinary. It asked to be trusted rather than admired. That, perhaps, is the truest description of Roman engineering as a habit of mind. An insistence that the invisible, patiently measured principle mattered more than the visible spectacle. That a structure's dignity lay in its quiet correctness rather than its show. But it would be a kind of dishonesty to let the story rest only on that abstraction, because gradient alone did not build the aqueducts. Hands did. Bodies did. The 400 miles of channel that eventually served Rome, and the many hundreds more that served the provincial cities scattered from Britain to North Africa, were raised by people whose names have almost entirely vanished from the record, and whose labour is preserved only in the stone they shaped, and occasionally, faintly, in the account books and legal texts that survived by accident rather than by intention. Some were free contractors, paid by the job, competing for tenders the way builders compete today. Some were slaves, condemned to the hardest and most dangerous work. The tunnelling through raw rock in the dark, the descent into wells sunk for ventilation shafts, the labour in quarries where a single, miscalculated cut could bring a ceiling down on the men beneath it. Some were soldiers, seconded from the legions to build channels in the provinces where military engineering skill served civil purposes as easily as martial ones. The same discipline that built roads and camps turned toward the patient business of carrying water across a landscape recently conquered, and now, however uneasily, being made Roman. All of them, whatever their status, whatever wage or absence of wage they received, contributed hours of effort that no ledger fully recorded. Effort that has to be understood, now mostly by inference, by counting the volume of stone moved and the depth of tunnels cut, and asking, gently, what that must have required of the people who did it. This is the human cost, bound up in every arch, every buried channel, every ventilation shaft sunk into a hillside so that the diggers below could breathe. It does not announce itself in the ruins that remain. A visitor standing before the Pont du Gard today, or walking the fields where the Aqua Marcia once ran on its raised arcade south of Rome, sees stone that has weathered into something almost natural, something that seems to belong to the landscape as fully as the hills themselves. The stone does not visibly carry the memory of the man who cut it, or the mason who set it, or the labourer who died in a tunnel collapse whose location is now unrecorded. And yet the memory is there, in a sense, folded into the mass of the structure, present in every measured block precisely because someone cut it to that measure, with tools no more sophisticated than iron and patience. Ingenuity and cost are not opposites in this story. They are the same fact seen from two directions. The gradient that seems, from a distance, like an elegant abstraction, was achieved only because a great many people spent a great many hours doing difficult, uncomfortable, sometimes fatal work in service of a plan that few of them would have been able to explain in full, and fewer still would live to see completed if the project spanned, as some of the greatest aqueducts did, the better part of a decade or more. That span of years is itself worth pausing over, because it points towards something that separates the Roman aqueducts from many later engineering achievements. Something almost unfashionable in the modern world's relationship to time. These were not projects conceived to be finished within a single political term, or built to satisfy an urgent, immediate crisis that could not wait. Rome had wells. Rome had the river. The city could have continued, in a strict sense, to survive without the Aqua Marcia or the Aqua Claudia or the Annio Novus, however diminished its comfort and its public life might have been. The aqueducts were not built because the city was dying of thirst. They were built because a civilization had decided, collectively and across generations, that the slow and enormous labor of bringing distant water into daily use was worth the years it would take, worth the treasuries it would empty, worth the maintenance it would demand forever afterward. This is a form of ambition that plans in centuries rather than years, that accepts an unfinished project as a normal condition of a long life, that trusts future magistrates and future engineers to continue what the present generation began and will not live to see completed. It is easy, looking back from a world accustomed to rapid construction and rapid obsolescence, to romanticize that patience. It should not be romanticized without qualification, because it rested, as has been said, on forced labor and conquest, and an empire's capacity to command resources that free negotiation would never have supplied so cheaply. And yet the patience itself, the willingness to conceive of infrastructure as a gift laid down for descendants rather than a convenience demanded for oneself, remains a rare enough quality in any age that it is worth noticing when it appears, and worth asking, quietly, what it would take to summon that same patience now, for different purposes, under different terms. The channels themselves, of course, no longer carry water into Rome. The springs that once fed the Aqua Marcia still rise in the hills where they always rose, indifferent to empires, but the elaborate machinery that once caught that water and coaxed it, mile after level mile, into the city has been broken and silent for a very long time, its channels dry, its settling tanks empty, its distribution towers reduced in most places to fragments of masonry, standing alone in fields where sheep graze, undisturbed by the memory of what once flowed past them. And it is in that stillness that the aqueducts perhaps speak most clearly now, in a way they could not have spoken when they were full and working and unremarkable, taken for granted by a city that expected water the way it expected sunrise. Picture then one particular fragment of arcade, somewhere in the countryside beyond Rome, where a run of arches still stands in a field at the hour just before full daylight. Mist gathers low across the grass, the way it does on cool mornings in that part of Italy, rising in thin, unhurried layers that catch the first pale light and hold it briefly before dispersing. The arches rise out of that mist in a long, broken rhythm, some intact across their full height, some reduced to stumps of pier where centuries of stone robbing and slow collapse have taken their toll. And through every one of them, the pale, early light passes freely now, since there is no channel left to shadow it, no rushing water to catch the sun the way it must once have caught it. High above the fields, invisible from below. No water moves through that channel anymore. Has not moved in longer than anyone now living can measure by memory rather than record. And still the stone stands, holding its old, patient line across the land, refusing for now to disappear, waiting the way it has always waited for whatever comes next. If chronicles like this one, of ambition raised slowly and carried a very long way, are the kind of company you enjoy keeping as the hours grow late, you are welcome to find more of them gathered quietly on this channel whenever you would like to return to them.